Hello and thank you for joining for today's cryptid horror stories. The first story today is about the Jorōgumo, the shapeshifting spider yōkai from Japanese mythology. Legend states that when an ordinary spider reaches 400 years of age, it grows to an immense size, gains supernatural powers, and develops an insatiable appetite for human flesh. A special force team and elite tactical unit specializing in cryptid neutralization. They are experts in biological anomalies, wendigos, chimeras, but are out of their depth with yōkai, which operate on spiritual and psychological logic rather than just biological ones. The second story today is about the Qilin, the benevolent chimerical creature from Chinese and East Asian mythology. Often called the Chinese unicorn, it features a dragon-like head, one or two horns, scaly body, resembling a deer, ox, or horse, an ox tail and cloven hooves. It is a powerful omen of prosperity, peace, and wisdom, but what happens when you anger it? A group of high-end eco-tourists and scholars visit a secluded, protected valley in East Asia, rumored to be the resting place of the Qilin. The guide warns them of the Taboo of Impact. The valley is a sanctuary of absolute stillness. To enter, one must move with humility and leave no trace. In the description below, the stories have been timestamped if you would like to skip to the second story. And now for today's cryptid horror stories. I hope you all enjoy. The Silk Lute. The debriefing room smelled of antiseptic and recycled air, a sterile cocktail of bleach and climate control that did nothing to mask the other scent, the one that rose from Kaido's own skin in waves that made his stomach clench with a nausea that no amount of washing could dispel. It was the smell of old copper, like pennies left too long in a damp pocket, layered beneath something floral and wrong, the sickly sweetness of orchids that had bloomed past their prime and begun the slow, inevitable descent into rot. He sat in the metal chair with his hands flat on the table, staring at the object that occupied the center of the otherwise empty surface, and he tried to remember a time when his life had not been divided into a before and an after, a line drawn in blood and silk that separated the person he had been from the thing he was becoming. The object on the table was a spider leg. That was the simplest, most clinical way to describe it, though the words failed to capture the reality of what lay before him. It was approximately 45 centimeters long, thick as a human femur at its base, tapering to a point that gleamed with a chitinous sharpness that caught the fluorescent light and refracted it into oily rainbows. The surface was banded in patterns of amber and black, the natural coloration of a creature that had evolved over centuries to hunt in shadows and webs. And it was twitching. Not consistently, not rhythmically, but every few minutes the severed appendage would spasm, the fine hairs that covered its surface bristling in a wave that traveled from base to tip like a ripple in disturbed water. The doctors had assured him it was a post-mortem nerve reaction, the lingering electrical potential in severed tissue finding random pathways to discharge. They had shown him diagrams. They had explained the biology. They had been very thorough, very professional, very insistent that what he was witnessing was normal. They had not been in the house. They had not heard the music. They had not felt the silk filling their lungs with each breath, the microscopic filaments settling in the alveoli like dust in an abandoned cathedral, turning respiration into a slow suffocation that felt like drowning in honey. Kaido raised his left forearm, rotating it to examine the burn that decorated his skin in a pattern of blistered tissue and weeping sores. The wound had been caused by a chemical solvent, hydrochloric acid mixed with an organic surfactant, originally designed for cleaning optical equipment. He had used it to dissolve the anchor line that held the house to the cliff. The memory of that moment came in fragments, like images viewed through shattered glass. The heat of the reaction, the steam rising from dissolving silk, the sound of the house groaning as its structural integrity surrendered to gravity and the waterfall below. But mostly he remembered the smell. The solvent had reacted with the spider's silk in a way that produced a vapor, caustic, coppery, floral, that had settled into his pores and refused to leave. "Sergeant Tanaka." The voice came from the speaker mounted in the ceiling, a disembodied presence that had been observing him for hours without revealing its source. Kaido didn't look up. He continued to stare at the spider leg, watching it twitch, waiting for the next spasm. "Sergeant Tanaka, we need you to begin your account. The team is waiting." "There is no team," Kaido said, his voice emerging from his throat like dust from a collapsed tomb. "There is only me, and the leg, and the music that won't stop playing." A pause, the hiss of static from the speaker. Then, "Please start from the beginning." The beginning. Kaido closed his eyes and let himself fall backward through memory, tumbling through the events that had led him to this room, this chair, this endless vigil over a severed appendage that should not be moving but was. The beginning had been 3 weeks ago, in a concrete bunker beneath the Ministry of Defense building in Tokyo, where Slayer 6 had assembled for what they had believed would be a routine operation. Slayer 6 was not an official designation. It was a call sign, a convenience, a way for the bureaucrats who funded them to refer to a unit that did not officially exist. They were a tactical team specializing in biological anomalies, creatures and entities that fell outside the boundaries of conventional zoology and into the shadowed territories where science and superstition overlapped. In their 5 years of operation, they had neutralized wendigos in the Canadian Rockies, contained chimeric organisms in the Caucasus, and exterminated a nest of lamprey-mouthed entities that had been preying on fishermen in the Baltic Sea. They were good at what they did, perhaps too good, perhaps good enough that they had begun to believe their own mythology. The team consisted of 6 operators, each selected for skills that extended beyond conventional military training. There was Captain Daniel Vance, an American expatriate who had spent 2 decades in special forces before joining the unit, his face a topography of scars and cynicism that spoke of encounters with things that no human should survive. There was Lieutenant Hiro Yamamoto, the point man, a former JGSDF reconnaissance specialist whose instincts for danger bordered on the preternatural. There was Sergeant Maria Petrov, the demolitions expert, a Russian émigré whose joy in destruction was matched only by her technical precision. There was Corporal James Jimmy Ockhaffer, the medic, whose gentle bedside manner concealed a capacity for violence that had saved the team on more than one occasion. There was Technician Yuki Sato, the communications and sensor specialist, whose equipment could detect electromagnetic anomalies that conventional military gear would miss entirely. And then there was Sergeant Kaido Tanaka, the narrator of this account, the sole survivor, the man who had held the solvent and struck the match that had reduced everything to ash and steam. The briefing had taken place in a room that smelled of stale coffee and old fear, the walls lined with photographs and maps that documented the unit's previous operations. Captain Vance had stood at the front, a laser pointer in his hand, his posture conveying the relaxed confidence of a man who had seen too much to be surprised by anything. "New target," Vance had said, clicking to the first slide of the presentation. The image showed a stretch of forest, dark and dense, the kind of Aokigahara-adjacent woodland that had inspired legends for centuries. Location: outskirts of Aokigahara near the base of Mount Fuji. Reports of disappearances over the past 6 months. Hikers mostly. A few locals. All vanished without trace, their belongings found intact, their footprints ending abruptly at various points along the forest trails. "Another Wendigo?" Petrov had asked, her fingers already tracing patterns on the table that suggested she was calculating blast yields. "Different," Vance had said. "Intelligence from the local authorities suggests a different classification, something from the Japanese tradition, something that doesn't operate on biological logic alone." The next slide had shown an artist's rendering based on witness descriptions. A beautiful woman in an archaic white kimono, her face serene and perfect, standing on the veranda of a traditional house that had no business existing in the modern forest. The rendering was based on the account of a single survivor, an elderly woman who had been collecting mushrooms near the forest's edge and had seen the figure beckoning to her from across a stream. The woman had fled, and when she had returned with authorities the next day, there had been no house, no woman, nothing but an empty clearing and a single strand of silk that had caught the morning light like a thread of liquid silver. Jorōgumo, Yuki Sato had whispered, the name emerging from her lips with a reverence that bordered on fear. A spider yōkai, 400 years old according to the folklore. Folklore, Petrov had repeated, making the word sound like a curse. We're chasing ghosts now. We're chasing whatever is killing people, Vance had replied, his voice hardening. Call it what you want. Ghost, demon, undocumented species. Our job is to locate it, neutralize it, and make sure the body count stops rising. The local authorities have classified this as a natural predator situation, but their own people won't go within a kilometer of the reported location. They're scared, and when the locals are scared, we get called in. Kaito had studied the rendering with the analytical eye of a man who had learned to treat the impossible as merely improbable. The Jorōgumo was a classic yōkai, a creature that appeared as a beautiful woman to lure victims into its web, where it would reveal its true form as a monstrous spider centaur and consume them. In the stories, it was a creature of seduction and betrayal, using its human appearance to lower the defenses of its prey before striking with the sudden, implacable violence of nature itself. The folklore mentioned specific vulnerabilities, Kaito had said, his finger tracing the rendering. Fire, sacred flames, purification rituals. If this thing operates on the same principles as the wendigos we encountered in Alberta. It doesn't, Sato had interrupted, her voice tight. That's the point. Wendigos are biological. They follow physical rules. Hunger, metabolism, thermodynamics. The Jorōgumo is different. It operates on spiritual logic, psychological logic. You can't kill it with bullets if it doesn't have a heart in the conventional sense. You can't burn it with fire if the fire doesn't touch what it truly is. Vance had nodded, his expression unreadable. Yuki's right. This mission requires a different approach. We're not going in as exterminators. We're going in as investigators. We locate the entity, assess its capabilities, and determine the most effective neutralization strategy. If that means incendiary rounds, we use them. If that means something else, we adapt. They had brought the incendiary rounds anyway, and the thermal imaging, and the high-caliber automatic weapons. Because despite Vance's words, despite Sato's warnings, the team had treated the mission as pest control. They had looked at the beautiful woman in the rendering and seen a target, a thing to be eliminated, a problem to be solved with the application of sufficient force. They had been wrong. They had been so catastrophically, cosmically wrong that the full magnitude of their error would only become apparent in the final moments, when the silk was already in their lungs and the music was already in their minds. The approach had begun at dawn, 3 days after the briefing. They had traveled by unmarked vehicle to a trailhead on the northern edge of the Aokigahara forest, a location chosen to avoid the more heavily trafficked tourist areas while still providing access to the region where the disappearances had been concentrated. The forest had been beautiful in the early light, the kind of Japanese woodland that appeared in watercolor paintings and poetic verses, tall cedars and pines rising in cathedral columns, their trunks draped in moss that glowed emerald in the filtered sunlight, the forest floor carpeted in ferns and fallen needles that softened every footfall into silence. But the beauty had been wrong. That was the first thing Kaito had noticed, the first detail that had registered in his subconscious as a warning that his conscious mind had been too slow to process. The colors were too saturated, the greens too green, the shadows too deep. The silence was wrong too, not the expectant hush of a forest holding its breath, but a deliberate manufactured quiet that suggested something had silenced the birds, the insects, the rustle of small animals in the undergrowth. Readings are off the scale, Sato had muttered, her eyes fixed on the portable sensor array she carried like a priestess consulting an oracle. Not just elevated. Wrong. The magnetic field in this area is fluctuating in patterns that don't correspond to any natural phenomenon I've ever encountered. Natural, Akafor had repeated, his voice carrying an edge of unease that was unusual for the normally unflappable medic. Is that what we're calling this? Stay sharp, Vance had ordered, his weapon held at low ready, his eyes scanning the tree line with the practiced sweep of a man who had learned to trust his peripheral vision more than his direct sight. Hiro, take point. Kaido, cover the left flank. Maria, watch our six. They had moved in standard tactical formation, their boots crunching against the needle-strewn ground, their weapons creating dark silhouettes against the green-filtered light. For the first hour, the hike had been uneventful, a strenuous but straightforward trek through terrain that, while challenging, offered no obvious threats. They had passed signs of human presence, discarded water bottles, trail markers, the occasional ribbon tied to a branch by hikers who had passed this way before. But these traces had grown fewer and fewer as they penetrated deeper into the forest, until they found themselves in a region that seemed untouched by human feet for decades. It was Hiro who had noticed the spatial anomaly first. They had been walking for approximately 90 minutes when the point man had stopped abruptly, his body going rigid with the tension of a dog catching an unexpected scent. "Captain," Hiro had said, his voice barely above a whisper, "we're walking in circles." "Impossible," Petrov had snapped. "We've been moving in a straight line. I've been tracking our heading on the compass." "Then explain that." Hiro had pointed to a tree approximately 20 meters ahead, a gnarled, ancient pine that leaned at a distinctive angle, its trunk twisted by decades of wind into a shape that was immediately recognizable. Kaido had seen that same tree 40 minutes earlier. He was certain of it. The angle of the lean, the pattern of moss on the bark, the way a particular branch forked into two identical limbs, all of it was burned into his memory with the clarity of a photograph. "We've passed it before," Hiro had continued, his voice steady but his hands trembling slightly on his weapon. "4 times. I counted. We keep walking straight and we keep coming back to this tree." The team had exchanged glances, the silence between them heavy with implications that none of them wanted to articulate. They had trained for biological threats, for creatures that bled and died according to the rules of physics and biology. They had not trained for forests that rearranged themselves, for spaces that violated the principles of Euclidean geometry. "Compass check," Vance had ordered. Petrov had produced her compass, holding it flat in her palm. The needle had spun lazily, completing a full rotation before settling on a heading that shifted even as they watched, drifting from north to northeast to east and back again, with a drunken randomness that made the instrument useless. "GPS is dead," Sato had reported, her fingers dancing across her sensor array. "Satellite connection lost. We're not just off the grid, we're off the map." They had continued anyway. That was the nature of the unit, the psychology that had been drilled into them through years of operations. You didn't retreat from the unknown, you confronted it. You didn't flee from the impossible, you analyzed it, neutralized it, reduced it to something comprehensible and manageable. It was a philosophy that had served them well against wendigos and chimeras. It was a philosophy that would prove utterly inadequate against something that operated on rules older than physics, older than biology, older than the human concept of causality. The house had appeared after their 4th passage of the crooked pine. It had not been there before. Kaido would stake his life on that observation, would swear it on whatever remained of his soul. They had walked past that particular stretch of forest 3 times, each time seeing nothing but trees and undergrowth and the endless, oppressive green. But on the 4th passage, the trees had parted like curtains, and the house had stood before them in all its impossible, anachronistic glory. It was a minka, a traditional Japanese farmhouse of a style that had not been built in 200 years. Its walls were constructed of dark timber frames filled with white plaster that had been maintained with a care that suggested recent occupancy. The roof was thatched with straw, thick and even, showing none of the decay or sagging that should have afflicted a structure exposed to the elements for decades. And it perched on the edge of a cliff that overlooked a waterfall, a torrent of white water that plunged into mist approximately 50 meters below, creating a constant roar that somehow failed to mask the deeper silence of the forest around it. "That's not possible," Petrov had whispered, her eyes wide with an expression that Kaido had never seen on her face before, something that looked uncomfortably like awe. "We surveyed this area by satellite last week. There was no house, there was no cliff, there was no waterfall." "And yet," Vance had said, his voice flat and controlled, "there it is." They had approached with the caution of men walking through a minefield, their weapons tracking across the house's windows and doors with the steady precision of targeting computers. The veranda had been empty, the shoji screens closed, the house presenting a face of perfect, impenetrable stillness. But the stillness had been wrong, Kaido had realized. It was the stillness of a spider waiting in its web, the patient immobility of a predator that had already detected the vibrations of approaching prey. "Thermal imaging," Vance had ordered. Sato had produced her thermal scope, aiming it at the house's windows and walls. "No readings," she had reported, her voice puzzled. "No body heat, no electrical signatures. The house is cold." "Then it's empty," Petrov had said, a note of relief creeping into her voice. "Or whatever is inside doesn't generate heat the way we understand it," Sato had countered. They had been debating their next move when the sound began. It was music, the soft, rhythmic plucking of strings that produced tones of crystalline purity and heartbreaking melancholy. The instrument was a biwa, Kaido had recognized immediately, the traditional Japanese lute whose 4 strings could produce sounds that ranged from the brutal percussion of battle narratives to the delicate whispering of love songs. But this music was different from any biwa performance he had ever heard. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, not projected through the air in conventional acoustic waves, but resonating inside the skull, vibrating against the bones of the inner ear with an intimacy that suggested the musician was playing directly on their nervous systems. "Do you hear that?" Okafor had asked, his hand rising to touch his temple as if he could feel the music entering through his skin. "Everyone hears it," Vance had replied, but his voice had lost its commanding edge, softening into something almost dreamy, almost contented. "Everyone hears it, and it's beautiful." Kaido had felt it too, the seductive warmth of the melody, the way it seemed to wrap around his anxiety and fear like a blanket, smothering the adrenaline and replacing it with a languid sense of safety that was utterly at odds with their situation. The music spoke of home, of childhood, of a mother's embrace and a father's protection. It whispered promises of rest and comfort, of an end to the endless vigilance that had defined his adult life. It suggested, with the gentle insistence of a lover's whisper, that they could put down their weapons, lower their guards, accept the hospitality that was being offered. "Captain," Hiro had said, his voice slurred with the same relaxation that was affecting them all. "Captain, I see someone." She had been standing on the veranda. Kaido had not seen her approach. He had not heard the shoji screen slide open. She had simply been there, materializing from the shadows of the house like a figure stepping out of a painting. And she was beautiful. That word was inadequate, Kaido knew even then, even through the fog of the music's influence. Beautiful was a descriptor for sunsets and paintings, and the smile of a lover on a summer afternoon. This woman's beauty was of a different order entirely, a perfection that approached the uncanny, the kind of aesthetic harmony that triggered not desire but awe, not lust but worship. She wore a white kimono of an archaic style, the fabric seeming to glow with its own internal luminescence in the filtered forest light. Her hair was black, arranged in an elaborate style that suggested the court fashions of the Heian period, with ornaments of silver and jade that caught the light and scattered it into prismatic fragments. Her face was pale, almost luminous, with features that seemed to have been carved by a master sculptor who had spent a lifetime studying the mathematics of proportion and symmetry. And her eyes were the color of dark amber, warm and depthless, containing an expression of welcome and compassion that made Kaido want to weep with gratitude. "You must be tired," she had said, and her voice had been the music made flesh, the biwa's melody given speech. "Travelers always are. Please come inside. I have tea. I have food. Rest yourselves. You are safe here." "We shouldn't," Sato had murmured, but even her protest had been weak, lacking conviction. Protocol says hostile engagement." "There's nothing hostile here," the woman had said, smiling with a warmth that made the forest seem cold by comparison. "Only hospitality, only rest, only the peace that you have been seeking for so long." Vance had lowered his weapon. Kaido had watched him do it, had watched the barrel of the rifle drift downward until it pointed at the wooden planks of the veranda, and he had felt no alarm. The gesture had seemed right, natural, inevitable. This woman was not a threat. This woman was a sanctuary. This woman was the answer to prayers they had not known they were praying. "Captain," Kaido had managed, the word emerging from his lips like a bubble rising through deep water. "Captain, the mission brief." "The mission brief said to locate and neutralize," Vance had replied, his voice distant and peaceful. "But there's nothing here to neutralize, only kindness, only rest." They had stepped onto the veranda as one, their boots thudding against the wooden planks with a solidity that should have been reassuring, but somehow felt hollow, like footsteps in a dream. The woman had smiled wider, revealing teeth that were small and perfect and white, and she had gestured toward the open doorway with a movement of her arm that was fluid and graceful and wrong. Her arm had bent backward at the elbow. Not much, just a few degrees beyond the normal range of human articulation. But Kaido had seen it, had noticed the way the joint had hyperextended in a direction that no human arm should be able to move, and the observation had registered in his subconscious as a warning that his conscious mind, sedated by the music, softened by the beauty, lulled by the promise of rest, had been too slow to process. "Please," the woman had said, her smile never wavering, her amber eyes warm and welcoming. "Come inside. The tea is getting cold." They had entered the house, and the door had closed behind them with a sound like silk sliding over silk, like the whisper of a web contracting around a struggling fly, like the beginning of a meal that would last for centuries. The music had followed them inside. And Kaido, sitting in the debriefing room 3 weeks later with the smell of copper and rotted orchids rising from his skin, and a severed spider leg twitching on the table before him, would remember that moment as the last second of his life when he had been fully human. Because everything that followed, the silk, the screaming, the dissolution of flesh and identity and self, had been something else entirely, something older, something hungrier, something that played its victims like instruments, drawing music from their terror that was sweeter than any human composition could ever hope to achieve. The leg twitched again, longer this time, the spasm traveling its full length in a wave that seemed almost deliberate. Kaido watched it, and waited, and listened for the music that he knew, with absolute certainty, was still playing somewhere in the darkness behind his eyes. The interior of the house defied the expectations that its exterior had created. From the veranda, the minka had appeared to be a simple, traditional structure, perhaps 4 rooms arranged in a square around a central hearth, the kind of farmhouse that had sheltered Japanese families for centuries before the modernization of the Meiji era. But stepping through the doorway, Kaido had found himself in a space that was simultaneously larger and more confounding than the exterior dimensions could possibly allow. The entryway was a jenkin, the traditional sunken space where shoes were removed before entering the living areas. But the step up from the jenkin led not to a single room, but to a corridor that stretched into darkness, its walls lined with sliding doors that seemed to multiply as Kaido watched, each panel decorated with painted scenes that shifted and changed when viewed from different angles. A landscape of mountains and pines became, with a blink, a seascape of crashing waves. A portrait of a courtesan in elaborate dress transformed into an anatomical study of a spider's eye. The paintings were not static decorations. They were alive, watching, adjusting themselves to the psychology of whoever stood before them. "Stay together," Vance had ordered, but his voice had lost its commanding edge, softened by the music that continued to pulse through their skulls in rhythmic waves of comfort and sedation. "Maintain visual contact. No one goes through a door alone." They had moved as a unit, their training asserting itself against the languid fog that threatened to dissolve their discipline into complacency. Kaido had taken the left flank, his weapon held at low ready, his eyes scanning the corridor for threats that refused to materialize in any conventional form. The floor beneath his boots had felt solid, had sounded solid, but there had been something wrong with the resonance of each footstep, a hollow quality that suggested the floorboards were not what they appeared to be. "The wood," Hiro had whispered, his fingers brushing against the wall as they moved. "It's warm, which shouldn't be warm, not like this." He was right. The temperature of the house was wrong in ways that Kaido's conscious mind struggled to catalog. The air was humid, thick with a moisture that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, carrying a scent that was floral and chemical in equal measure. The smell of fresh silk, Kaido realized, the protein-based secretion of spiders that had been dried and cured into a substance that resembled polished lacquer more than organic material. The floorboards, the walls, the ceiling, all of it was permeated with this substance. All of it was slowly, imperceptibly, beginning to adhere to their clothing and skin. "Masks on," Kaido had said, his voice emerging sharper than he had intended, cutting through the sedative haze of the music. "Something in the air. We need filtration." The team had responded with the automatic compliance of professionals who had learned to trust their comrades' instincts above their own perceptions. They had donned their tactical respirators, compact units designed to filter biological contaminants and chemical agents, and Kaido had felt an immediate, if partial, clearing of his thoughts as the music was muffled by the layers of activated carbon and particulate filters. The melody didn't stop. It continued to resonate in his bones, in his teeth, in the fluid of his inner ear. But the direct assault on his consciousness was reduced, allowing a sliver of rational analysis to penetrate the fog. "This isn't a house," he had said, his voice muffled by the mask. "It's a web. Everything about it is designed to capture and hold." "Nonsense," Vance had replied, but there had been uncertainty in his voice, the first crack in the armor of the music's influence. "It's just an old building, humidity from the waterfall, traditional construction materials." "Then explain the doors." They had been walking for what felt like 10 minutes, moving in a straight line down a corridor that should have carried them clear through the house and out the other side. But the corridor continued, branching into side passages that opened and closed like valves in a biological system, leading them deeper into a labyrinth that had no right to exist within the footprint of a simple farmhouse. They had passed through rooms that contained furniture, low tables, cushions, tea sets arranged with the meticulous care of a host preparing for honored guests. But the rooms had been wrong, their proportions subtly distorted, their corners angled in ways that made Kaido's eyes ache and his balance falter. And the dust. Kaido had noticed the dust floating in the air, motes of pale matter that drifted in the light filtering through the shoji screens, and he had initially dismissed it as the natural accumulation of age in an abandoned structure. But the dust had moved with intention, clustering around the team's faces and hands, settling on exposed skin with a persistence that suggested adhesion rather than gravity. When Kaido had wiped his forehead, his glove had come away covered in a fine, fibrous film that stretched between his fingers like melted sugar. "The dust is silk," Sato had said, her voice emerging from behind her mask with a note of rising panic. "Microscopic filaments. They're in the air. They're getting through the filters." She was right. Kaido could feel it now, the barely perceptible resistance in his lungs with each breath, the sensation of inhaling not air but a suspension of tiny threads that were slowly, patiently, beginning to coat the interior surfaces of his respiratory system. The silk was in his throat, in his bronchial tubes, in the delicate alveoli where oxygen exchanged with blood. It wasn't killing him yet. The filaments were too fine to cause immediate obstruction, but they were accumulating, layer by layer, breath by breath, turning his lungs into repositories for a substance that would eventually harden and constrict and suffocate. "We need to get out," Petrov had said, her voice tight with the first genuine fear Kaido had heard from her. "Back to the entrance, now." They had turned, as one, and discovered that the corridor behind them had changed. The passage they had followed into the depths of the house was gone. In its place stood a wall of what appeared to be solid wood, decorated with the same shifting paintings that adorned the other panels. The jenkin, the veranda, the forest beyond, all of it was sealed behind an architecture that rewrote itself according to rules that had nothing to do with physics and everything to do with appetite. "She's hurting us," Hiro had said, his weapon tracking across the impossible wall, his knuckles white on the grip. "The woman, the Jorōgumo, she's directing us deeper into the structure." "Then we don't follow her directions," Vance had decided, his command voice reasserting itself with an effort that was visible in the tension of his jaw. "We breach the walls. Petrov, prepare shaped charges. We're cutting our way out." Petrov had moved with the efficiency of long practice, producing a compact breaching charge from her kit and pressing it against the wooden panel with adhesive backing. The charge was small but potent, designed to punch holes in reinforced doors without collapsing surrounding structures. She had set the timer for 10 seconds and stepped back, her hands over her ears, her mouth forming the countdown. 3, 2, 1. The detonation had been a dull thump rather than the sharp crack that Kaido had expected, a muffled explosion that seemed to be absorbed by the walls rather than reflected by them. And when the smoke had cleared, the panel had remained intact. No, not intact, changed. The wood where the charge had been placed was now decorated with a painting of Petrov herself, her face frozen in an expression of mounting terror, her body depicted in the moment of the detonation with a fidelity that suggested the house had been watching, recording, incorporating her fear into its permanent decoration. The painting moved, her image in the artwork shifting and breathing, opening her mouth in a silent scream that matched the real Petrov's expression of disbelief. "What the fuck?" Akafor had whispered, and the profanity had sounded like a prayer. The biwa music had reached a crescendo then, the individual notes blurring into a continuous wall of sound that resonated in Kaido's sternum and made his vision pulse with each vibration. And in the spaces between the notes, he had heard something else, a sound like fabric tearing, like joints popping, like the wet, organic noise of a body rearranging itself into configurations that human anatomy had never intended. "Contact!" Hiro had screamed, his weapon rising. But there was nothing to shoot. The corridor was empty, the painted doors closed, the shifting artwork continuing its slow, hypnotic dance. And yet, one by one, the team members had begun to stop. It happened without violence, without attack, without any visible aggression. Yuki Sato had been the first. She had been walking beside Kaido, her sensor array clutched in hands that were trembling with adrenaline and fear when her stride had simply ceased. Her left foot had come down on the floorboard, her right foot had begun to swing forward, and then she had frozen, her body going rigid, her eyes rolling back until only the whites were visible. The sensor array had slipped from her fingers and struck the floor with a sound like a bell tolling underwater. "Yuki," Kaido had grabbed her shoulder, shaking her with a violence born of panic. "Yuki, respond." Her body had been warm but unresponsive. her muscles locked in a state of tetanic rigidity that suggested neurological interference rather than physical injury. And when Kaido had peeled back her eyelid, he had seen something that made his blood run cold. The whites of her eyes were coated in a fine film of silk, the microscopic filaments that had been accumulating in the air now crystallizing across the surface of her corneas, forming a translucent layer that was slowly, inexorably, sealing her eyes shut. "She's cocooned," Kaido had said, his voice barely audible above the music. From the inside, the silk in her lungs, her bloodstream, her nervous system, it's shutting her down, preserving her. "That's impossible," Vance had said, but the words had been automatic, reflexive, the denial of a man whose worldview was collapsing faster than he could rebuild it. "Nothing about this is possible," Kaido had replied, "and yet here we are." Hiro had been the next to fall. He had been attempting to force one of the painted doors, his shoulder ramming against the wood with impacts that should have splintered the frame, when his movements had simply decelerated, his struggles slowing like a film running out of projector speed, until he had stood with his hands pressed against the door in a posture of frozen desperation, his mouth open in a scream that produced no sound. His skin had begun to change color, taking on a pale, waxy sheen that suggested the silk was migrating through his tissues, consolidating, preparing. Okafor had tried to run. The medic had bolted down the corridor, his boots pounding against the floorboards with a desperate rhythm, and for a moment it had seemed that he might actually escape, might find a passage that led back to the veranda and the forest and the sane, rational world beyond. But the corridor had twisted, bending in a direction that geometry did not permit, and Okafor had found himself running directly back toward the team, his face a mask of disbelief as he emerged from a side passage that should not have connected to the one he had left. "The house is a labyrinth," Kaido had realized, speaking the words aloud as if saying them could make them comprehensible. "It moves, it changes, it doesn't follow spatial rules because it's not a building, it's a digestive system, and we're inside it." The ceiling had collapsed then. Not with the violence of structural failure, but with the deliberate, controlled precision of a predator revealing itself. The painted panels had parted like curtains, the wooden beams had separated with the soft, tearing sound of silk being stretched to its limit, and the Jorōgumo had descended into the corridor with a grace that was obscene in its beauty. Her true form was a revelation that bypassed the eyes and went directly to the hindbrain, a neurological shock that produced not fear but something deeper, a species-level recognition of predation that predated human consciousness by millions of years. The human portion remained, the beautiful face, the perfect features, the white kimono that still clung to the torso with an elegance that mocked the grotesquerie beneath. But below the waist, the body transitioned into something that defied taxonomy and sanity alike. 8 legs emerged from the junction where human hips should have been, each appendage thick as a man's thigh and segmented with the armored joints of an arachnid. They were banded in patterns of amber and black, the same coloration as the severed leg that would later sit on the debriefing table, and they terminated in points that gleamed with a chitinous sharpness that could punch through flesh and bone with equal ease. The abdomen, swollen and grotesque, hung behind the human torso like a grotesque pregnancy, its surface covered in fine hairs that bristled and settled in waves of autonomous motion. And the webs, they were everywhere, filling the spaces between the ceiling beams and the walls in a complex architecture that suggested not random construction but deliberate design, a three-dimensional map of silk that served as nervous system, sensory organ, and digestive tract all in one. The Jorōgumo moved through these webs with the ease of a fish swimming through water, her 8 legs finding purchase on strands that should not have been able to support her weight, her body suspended in a geometry of thread and tension that was as much a part of her as her own flesh. "Incendiaries," Vance had screamed, his training finally overriding his shock. "Fire at will." The team had responded with the desperate violence of cornered animals. Petrov had been the first to fire, her incendiary rounds punching into the creature's abdomen with impacts that should have ignited the silk, should have consumed the webs, should have turned the entire corridor into an inferno of purifying flame. The rounds struck true, burying themselves in the swollen segments of the spider body, and for a moment Kaido had allowed himself to believe that the nightmare was ending, that science and violence would triumph over folklore and superstition as they always had before. But the silk did not burn. The incendiary rounds detonated in flashes of white heat that Kaido could feel against his face even through the respirator. But the webs absorbed the energy with a serenity that suggested they had been engineered specifically to resist flame. The silk charred slightly at the impact points, turning black and brittle, but the surrounding thread simply redirected the heat, dissipating it through the network in patterns that left the overall structure intact. The Jorōgumo had not even flinched. She had continued her descent, her human face smiling with an expression of gentle patience, as if the gunfire were merely a minor inconvenience in an otherwise pleasant afternoon. "It doesn't work," Petrov had screamed, her voice breaking. "The fire doesn't work." She had tried to reload, her hands shaking so violently that the magazines clattered against each other like bones in a wind chime, and in that moment of vulnerability, the Jorōgumo had struck. Not with her fangs, not with the venom-dripping chelicerae that protruded from beneath her human jaw like obscene jewelry. She had struck with her webs, shooting them from spinnerets hidden in the joints of her human wrists in thick ropes that traveled faster than the eye could follow. The first strand had caught Petrov across the chest, wrapping around her torso with the speed and precision of a lasso, and before the demolitions expert could react, she had been hoisted into the air with a sudden violence that made Kaido's stomach lurch. The Jorōgumo had not simply lifted her. She had manipulated the silk with a skill that suggested centuries of practice, spinning Petrov in midair like a dancer on an invisible stage, wrapping additional strands around her limbs and torso with each rotation. The silk contracted as it dried, tightening around Petrov's body with a force that was immediately audible, the cracking of ribs, one by one, like dry twigs snapping underfoot. Petrov had screamed, a sound of pure, unadulterated agony that cut through the biwa music with the clarity of a blade, and then the scream had been cut short as the silk wrapped around her face, sealing her mouth, her nose, her eyes in a layer of translucent membrane that reduced her to a cocoon shape suspended in the webs above. But she was still alive. That was the horror that Kaido would carry with him forever, the image that would visit him in the dark hours before dawn. The cocoon was translucent enough to show Petrov's face pressed against the inner surface, her eyes wide and aware, her body still struggling against the constriction even as the Jorōgumo began to secrete. The secretion was a clear fluid that emerged from glands along the creature's abdomen, dripping onto the cocoon in a steady, deliberate rain. Where it touched the silk, the membrane began to dissolve, not in destruction but in preparation, the silk becoming porous, absorbent, ready to receive. And where the fluid touched Petrov's exposed skin, a patch on her forearm where the cocoon had not yet fully sealed, it began to digest. The flesh did not melt, it did not blacken or char, it simply softened, the proteins breaking down into a consistency that resembled warm gelatin, the blood vessels leaking their contents in a slow, controlled dissolution that preserved the structure while destroying the function. Petrov's arm turned the color of cooked meat, the muscles separating from the bone with a wet, sucking sound that was audible even over the music. And through it all, her eyes remained open, watching, aware, conscious in a body that was being prepared for consumption while she was still inhabiting it. "Oh God," Akafor had whispered, and the words were the last he would speak as a free man. The Jorōgumo had turned her attention to the remaining team members with a speed that suggested she had never been distracted, had never lost track of her inventory. Her human face had smiled, the same warm, welcoming smile she had offered on the veranda, and she had extended one delicate hand toward Akafor in a gesture that was almost maternal. "Don't be afraid," she had said, her voice still the music made flesh, still the melody of comfort and safety. "I will take care of you, I will keep you. You will be part of something beautiful." Akafor had tried to run again, but the webs had closed around him, threads dropping from the ceiling and rising from the floor in a three-dimensional trap that was as inescapable as gravity itself. He had been lifted, like Petrov, like Sato, like Hiro, and wrapped in silk that contracted with each passing second, compressing his body into a shape that was convenient for storage and display. Vance had emptied his magazine into the creature's human torso, the high-velocity rounds punching through the white kimono and into the flesh beneath with impacts that should have been fatal to anything biological. But the Jorōgumo had simply absorbed the damage, her body knitting itself together with a speed that defied cellular biology, the bullet wounds closing like mouths swallowing food, leaving behind only pale scars that faded as quickly as they had formed. "Bullets don't hurt her," Vance had said, his voice hollow, his weapon clicking empty. "Nothing hurts her." "She's not flesh," Kaido had realized, the understanding crystallizing in his mind with the terrible clarity of a drowning man's final thought. "Not entirely. She's spirit wrapped in silk, memory given form. You can't shoot a memory. You can't burn a story." The Jorōgumo had turned her amber eyes toward him then, and in that gaze Kaido had seen something that made his blood run cold. Recognition. Not of his face, not of his name, but of his understanding. She knew that he had seen through her, that he had penetrated the surface of the myth to glimpse the architecture of hunger beneath. And she had smiled, not the warm, welcoming smile of the host, but something older, something hungrier, something that acknowledged him as a worthy opponent in a game that had been playing out for centuries. "You see," she had said, and the words were not a question but a statement of fact. "You see what the others do not. That is why you will be the last. That is why you will be the most beautiful." She had not attacked him. Not then. Instead, she had turned her attention back to Vance, who had been attempting to reload with hands that trembled so violently he could barely seat the magazine. The captain had looked up, had met the creature's gaze, and in that moment something had passed between them, a communication that transcended words, a negotiation between predator and prey that ended only one way. "Run, Kaido," Vance had said, his voice steady despite the terror in his eyes. "Find a way out, get to the cliff, don't look back." "Captain." "That's an order, Sergeant." The Jorōgumo had enveloped Vance in silk before Kaido could respond, wrapping him in a cocoon that was thicker, more elaborate, more ornate than the others, a work of art that suggested the creature recognized his status, his authority, his value as a specimen. The captain had not screamed. He had simply disappeared into the white folds, his body lifted into the rafters to hang beside the others, a collection of living sacrifices suspended in the architecture of the spider's hunger. And Kaido had run. He had sprinted down the corridor that Vance's sacrifice had opened, the creature apparently satisfied enough with her newest acquisition to allow one prey to escape, for now. The labyrinth had twisted around him, the rooms shifting and reconfiguring in a maze that seemed designed to confuse and delay. But Kaido had not been trying to find the exit. He had been trying to find the center. Because in the chaos of the attack, in the horror of watching his team being consumed one by one, Kaido had remembered something from the briefing that had seemed irrelevant at the time. The Jorōgumo did not simply eat her victims. She collected them. She displayed them. She integrated them into her web, turning their nervous systems into extensions of her own sensory apparatus, using their pain and fear as alarm bells that warned her of approaching threats. And if she was using them as alarms, then they were still alive, still conscious, still connected to the web that was the Jorōgumo's true body. Kaido had needed to find them, needed to reach them, needed to understand what the creature was doing with their minds before he could find a way to destroy her. The corridor had opened into a chamber that was larger than the others, a vaulted space that extended upward into darkness and downward into a pit that seemed to have no bottom. And suspended in that space, arranged in a three-dimensional constellation that defied gravity and reason, were the previous victims. The pantry. Kaido had stared upward, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness to illuminate shapes that his mind struggled to process and accept. There were dozens of them, perhaps hundreds, suspended in silk cocoons that hung from the ceiling like grotesque fruit, their bodies arranged in patterns that suggested not random storage but deliberate curation. Some were fresh, their faces visible through the translucent membranes, their eyes moving, their mouths opening and closing in silent screams. Others were older, desiccated, their bodies reduced to mummified husks that still retained enough neural function to serve as permanent fixtures in the spider's sensory network. And the sounds. They were not silent. Each cocoon emitted a faint vibration, a tremor that traveled through the silk threads and converged on the center of the chamber where the Jorōgumo's primary abdomen hung like a grotesque chandelier. The vibrations were voices. Kaido had realized with a horror that transcended language. The victims were speaking, or trying to speak, their vocal cords paralyzed by the silk, but their nervous systems still transmitting signals that the web translated into sound. "Help me!" The voice had come from directly above him, and Kaido had aimed his flashlight upward to see a cocoon that hung approximately 3 meters above his head. The face inside was that of a young man, perhaps 20 years old, his features still recognizable despite the layers of silk that compressed his features into a mask of suffering. His eyes had tracked Kaido's light. His mouth had formed words that his paralyzed throat could not voice, but the vibrations traveled through the silk and emerged as whispers in the air around Kaido's head. "Help me, please, it's been so long." "How long?" Kaido had whispered, not expecting an answer but unable to stop himself from asking. "Weeks, months, I don't know, she keeps us. She feeds us through the silk, we don't die, we can't die, we just stay forever." Kaido had swept his flashlight across the chamber, counting the cocoons, estimating the time they represented. If each victim had been preserved for weeks or months, then the Jorōgumo had been hunting this forest for years, perhaps decades. The disappearances that had drawn Slayer 6 to this location were not a recent phenomenon. They were the latest entries in a ledger of consumption that stretched back centuries. "Where is she?" Kaido had asked the young man. "Where is the main body, the heart?" "There is no heart," the whisper had replied, and the voice had changed, shifting from the young man's panic to something else, something familiar, something that made Kaido's blood run cold. "There is only the web. The web is everything. The web is forever." The voice had been Vance's. Kaido had spun, his flashlight beam dancing across the chamber, and he had seen it. A cocoon that hung slightly apart from the others, positioned at a node in the web where multiple threads converged. The face inside was the captain's, or what remained of it, the features distorted by compression and silk, but still recognizable. And the mouth had been moving, forming words that emerged not from Vance's throat but from the web itself, the vibrations traveling through the silk to produce a perfect imitation of his voice. "Kaido," the web had said, using Vance's vocal patterns, his cadence, his authority. "Come closer. I need to tell you something important about the mission." "You're not Vance," Kaido had whispered, his back pressed against the wall, his weapon forgotten in his hand. "I am what remains," the voice had replied. "I am memory, I am story, I am the song that the Jorōgumo weaves. Come closer, Kaido. Let me show you what she has shown me. The beauty, the peace, the end of all fear." The Jorōgumo had been playing with him, using the voices of his dead teammates to lure him deeper into the web, to break his spirit before she broke his body. Kaido had understood the strategy with a clarity that was almost academic, the analytical detachment of a man who had accepted that he was going to die, and was now simply studying the mechanics of his own destruction. But understanding the trap did not mean he could avoid it. The web had been everywhere, filling the chamber in a three-dimensional lattice that left no path untouched, no surface unclaimed. The Jorōgumo had built her lair with the meticulous care of an architect who had millennia to perfect her design, and every strand served a purpose. Every thread was a nerve ending, a digestive organ, a sensory apparatus. Kaido had needed to find the anchor, the primary line that held the entire structure to the cliff, the central thread that connected the house to the geological reality beyond its impossible geometry. If he could sever that connection, if he could dissolve the silk that held the house suspended over the waterfall, then the entire structure would collapse. The web would be destroyed. The victims would be released, one way or another. And he had known, with a certainty that bordered on prophecy, that there was only one substance in his possession that could damage the Jorōgumo's silk: the chemical solvent, the hydrochloric acid mixture, the cleaning solution that had been designed to remove optical residue and was now, impossibly, the only weapon that mattered. He had reached for his pack, his fingers finding the familiar shape of the solvent container, and he had begun to plan his final stand. The Jorōgumo had been watching from the shadows, her 8 legs folded beneath her in a posture of patient anticipation, her human face smiling with the warmth of a host who knows that the feast is about to begin. "Come," she had whispered, and the word had been the music, the biwa, the song that would never stop playing. "Come and be part of the tapestry." Kaido had gripped the solvent container and prepared to run toward the anchor line, toward the waterfall, toward the only escape that remained. The final movement was about to begin. The anchor line was not where Kaido expected it to be. In a rational world, in a structure that obeyed the laws of physics and engineering, the primary support cable, or in this case, the primary silk strand, would have been located at the center of the house, running vertically from the foundation to the roof, providing the central tension that held the entire impossible architecture in place. But the Jorōgumo's house did not follow rational principles. It followed the logic of a spider's web, where the strongest strands were not necessarily the most central but the most strategic, positioned to catch the maximum amount of force and distribute it through the network in patterns that ensured structural integrity even under extreme stress. Kaido had found it by following the vibrations. The silk threads that filled the pantry chamber were not passive supports. They were alive with information, humming with the accumulated memories of hundreds of victims whose nervous systems had been integrated into the Jorōgumo's network. As Kaido moved through the chamber, his flashlight beam cutting desperate arcs through the darkness, he had felt the vibrations against his skin like a language spoken in frequencies too low for human ears to process as sound. The threads nearest the outer walls had thrummed with the dull, monotonous rhythm of the oldest victims, those who had been reduced to little more than biological batteries. Their minds collapsed into repetitive loops of fear and pain that served no purpose but to maintain the web's baseline energy. The threads closer to the center had carried more complex patterns, the memories of more recent acquisitions, their neural activity still robust enough to contribute sophisticated sensory data to the network. And one thread, a cable as thick as Kaido's wrist that emerged from the ceiling and plunged through the floor into the darkness below, had resonated with a frequency that was different from all the others. It had not carried the echoes of victim consciousness. It had carried something older, something more powerful, something that felt like the Jorōgumo's own heartbeat translated into physical vibration. This was the anchor line. This was the thread that connected the house to the cliff, that held the entire structure suspended over the waterfall, that provided the tensile strength necessary to maintain the impossible architecture. "You feel it," a voice had whispered, and Kaido had spun to find the Jorōgumo watching him from the shadows at the chamber's edge. Her human face had been visible in the dim light, her amber eyes glowing with an internal luminescence that matched the bioluminescent fungi he had seen in other lairs, other webs, other nightmares that he had thought were behind him. You feel the thread that holds everything together, the thread that is everything. Kaido had said nothing. He had been calculating distances, estimating the amount of solvent required, trying to remember the chemical reaction rates from the equipment manual that he had read once, years ago, in a different life. Hydrochloric acid reacted with protein-based fibers in a process called hydrolysis, breaking the peptide bonds that held the protein chains together and reducing the silk to a slurry of amino acids and water. But spider silk was not ordinary protein. It was a composite material, reinforced with crystalline structures and metallic ions that gave it strength comparable to steel. The dissolution would not be instantaneous. It would require time, and time was the one commodity that Kaido did not have. "You think you can destroy me," the Jorōgumo had said, and her voice had carried not anger but a kind of maternal sadness, the disappointment of a host whose guest has failed to appreciate the honor of the invitation. "You think that if you cut the thread, the house will fall, and I will die, and your friends will be saved. But the thread is not the web, little hunter. The web is not the house is not the body. I am all of these things and none of them. I am the memory of every victim I have collected. I am the story that they tell in the dark hours before dawn. I am the music that plays in the spaces between heartbeats." She had moved closer, her 8 legs rippling in waves of motion that carried her across the web without disturbing a single strand. The movement was hypnotic, beautiful in the same way that a shark's approach is beautiful, the grace of a predator that has never needed to evolve fear. "Do you know what I do with them?" she had asked, gesturing toward the suspended cocoons with one delicate human hand. "Do you know why I keep them? It is not for hunger alone. Hunger is simple. Hunger is biological. I am older than biology. I keep them because they are stories. Because every life is a thread, and every thread can be woven into a greater pattern. I am weaving a tapestry, little hunter, a tapestry of memory and fear and love and loss, a tapestry that will exist long after the last human has turned to dust. And your thread is special." Kaido had felt the weight of her attention like a physical pressure against his chest, a compression that made his ribs ache and his breathing shallow. The Jorōgumo was not merely speaking. She was reaching into him somehow, touching the edges of his consciousness with sensory organs that he could not see and did not understand. "You have seen death," she had continued, her voice dropping to a whisper that resonated in the hollow spaces behind his eyes. "You have caused death. You have carried the weight of guilt and responsibility and the terrible knowledge that survival is not always a blessing. These are the threads I value most. The threads of conflict, of moral ambiguity, of the struggle between what you are and what you wish to be. Your teammates were simple. Their threads were pure, duty, courage, loyalty. But you are complicated. You are beautiful, and your place in my tapestry will be the centerpiece." Kaido had understood then with a clarity that transcended terror the true nature of the Jorōgumo's hunger. She was not consuming flesh. She was consuming identity. She was not digesting bodies. She was archiving souls. Each victim she took became part of a composite narrative, a shared hallucination that existed in the space between the silk threads, a collective memory that grew richer and more complex with each edition. The pantry was not a larder. It was a library, and the books were still alive. "Your captain," the creature had said, her voice shifting to perfectly mimic Vance's cadence, his authority, his particular blend of cynicism and duty. "He thought he was saving you. He thought his sacrifice would buy you time, but sacrifice is just another thread, little hunter, another color in the tapestry, and now his sacrifice is part of me. His courage, his guilt, his love for his team, all of it, mine." The voice had been so perfect, so exact, that Kaido had felt his resolve waver. The Jorōgumo was not merely imitating Vance. She was embodying him, wearing his memories like a costume, moving through his cognitive patterns with an intimacy that suggested she had swallowed not just his body but his selfhood. "He's still in there," Kaido had whispered, the realization emerging from his lips before he could stop it. They're all still in there. You haven't killed them. You've incorporated them." "Killed?" The creature had laughed, and the sound had been the biwa music-made laughter, a harmonic resonance that made the webs vibrate in sympathy. "Death is a human concept, a biological necessity. I offer something better. I offer permanence. I offer significance. I offer the chance to be part of a story that will outlast civilizations. Is that not what all humans want, to be remembered, to matter? In my tapestry, they matter forever." Kaido had gripped the solvent container until his knuckles turned white, feeling the plastic flecks under the pressure of his fingers. The Jorōgumo was wrong. She had to be wrong. Permanence without choice was not significance. It was imprisonment. Memory without consent was not immortality. It was violation. "No," he had said, and the word had been small and fragile in the vastness of the chamber, but it had been enough. "No, they don't want to be part of your story. They want to be free, and I'm going to free them." He had lunged toward the anchor line, his boots slipping on the silk-slicked floor, his free hand grasping for purchase on the sticky threads that filled the air like a three-dimensional fog. The Jorōgumo had moved with a speed that should have been impossible for a creature of her size, her 8 legs propelling her across the chamber in a blur of segmented motion, her human hands extended in a gesture that was simultaneously welcoming and predatory. "Little hunter," she had said, and her voice had been everywhere, emerging from the silk, from the walls, from the vibrations in Kaido's own skull. "You cannot escape. You cannot destroy. You can only become." Kaido had reached the anchor line and pressed the nozzle of the solvent container against the thick cable, squeezing the trigger with a desperation that made his hand cramp. The hydrochloric acid mixture had emerged in a thick stream, striking the silk with a sound like bacon hitting a hot pan, and the reaction had been immediate and violent. The silk had screamed. Not literally. The sound had been chemical rather than vocal, a high-frequency shriek of molecular bonds breaking under the assault of the acid. But the scream had traveled through the web, through the walls, through the floor, until the entire house had seemed to convulse with the pain of the wound. The anchor line had bubbled and smoked, the translucent fibers dissolving into a gray slurry that dripped onto Kaido's boots and ate through the leather with a hissing fury. "No," the Jorōgumo's voice had been distorted, fragmented, no longer the music of seduction but the discordant shriek of an instrument being destroyed. "You cannot. You will not." She had struck him then, one massive foreleg sweeping across the space between them with a speed that Kaido's peripheral vision could not track. The impact had caught him across the chest, lifting him from his feet and hurling him across the chamber with a force that should have shattered his ribs, his spine, his skull. But the webs had caught him, the sticky threads wrapping around his limbs and torso with a gentleness that was more terrible than the blow itself, cradling him like a mother holding a child, supporting his weight as the momentum of the impact dissipated through the elastic network. "You hurt me," the Jorōgumo had said, and her voice had carried genuine surprise, the confusion of a predator who had never been wounded by prey. "You actually hurt me." Kaido had hung in the webs, his body immobilized by silk that was tightening with each passing second, his arms pinned to his sides, his legs wrapped in a cocoon that was beginning to climb toward his waist. The solvent container had fallen from his hand, striking the floor below and rolling toward the edge of the chamber where the darkness of the pit swallowed the light. He had watched it go with a despair that was colder than the silk against his skin. "Pain is a teacher," the Jorōgumo had said, moving closer, her face filling his vision with its terrible, perfect beauty. "And you have taught me that you are worthy of special attention, not the quick collection, not the simple preservation. You will be the centerpiece, little hunter. You will be the thread around which the entire tapestry is woven." She had reached out with one human hand, her fingers touching Kaido's cheek with a gentleness that made his skin crawl. The touch had been warm, almost feverish, and it had carried a sensation that was not physical but emotional, a wave of comfort and safety and absolute belonging that washed over his terror like a tide drowning a flame. The Jorōgumo was in his mind, he had realized. She was touching not just his body but his memories, his emotions, the deepest structures of his identity. "You lost someone," she had whispered, and the words had been not a question but a statement of intimate knowledge. "A sister, when you were young. You watched her die and you could not save her. The guilt has been with you ever since. It is the thread that defines you, the thread that drives you, the thread that makes you beautiful." Kaido had tried to close his mind, to build walls around the memory that she had unearthed. But the Jorōgumo's touch had been insistent, invasive, as unstoppable as water finding its way through cracks in stone. He had seen his sister's face, 10 years old, smiling in the sunlight of a summer afternoon that had existed in a world before monsters and silk and the smell of rotted orchids. He had seen her eyes, dark and alive, filled with the trust that children place in older siblings who are supposed to protect them from everything. And he had seen her death, the leukemia that had consumed her in 6 months, the hospital room that had smelled of antiseptic and despair, the moment when her hand had gone limp in his, and the machines had flatlined with a sound that had echoed in his nightmares for 20 years. "I can bring her back," the Jorōgumo had promised, her voice merging with the memory of his sister's laughter, using the cadence of a voice he had thought he would never hear again. "I can weave her into the tapestry. You can be with her forever. All you have to do is let go. Let go of your resistance. Let go of your fear. Let the silk take you and you will never be alone again." The temptation had been overwhelming. Kaido had felt his resolve crumbling, his identity dissolving into the warm embrace of the offer. He had been so tired, so alone, so burdened by the weight of survival and guilt and the endless, grinding responsibility of being the one who lived when others died. The silk had promised rest. The tapestry had promised connection. The Jorōgumo had promised an end to the loneliness that had defined his existence since the moment his sister's hand had gone cold. But somewhere in the depths of his dissolving consciousness, a spark had remained, a hard, stubborn ember of refusal that had survived every horror, every loss, every moment when giving up would have been easier than continuing. It was not courage. It was not hope. It was simply the refusal to surrender, the same reflexive stubbornness that had kept him moving through frozen forests and burning deserts and the countless other nightmares that had defined his career. "No," he had whispered, the word emerging from his lips like a bubble rising through deep water. "What?" The Jorōgumo's voice had shifted, losing the warmth of his sister's memory, reverting to something colder, harder, more dangerous. "No," louder this time, stronger. "You don't get her, you don't get any of them, and you don't get me." He had moved with a violence that surprised even himself, arching his back against the webs that held him, using the elasticity of the silk to create a pendulum motion that swung his body toward the anchor line. The Jorōgumo had lunged, her forelegs slashing through the air where his head had been moments before. But Kaido had already reached the thick cable, already wrapped his legs around it, already felt the acid-eaten fibers giving way under the renewed pressure of his weight. "No!" The creature's scream had been the biwa music shattering into discord, the harmony dissolving into chaos. Kaido had reached into his belt pouch with his one free hand, finding the small thermite charge that Petrov had given him during the briefing, a compact incendiary device designed for emergency demolitions, capable of burning at temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Celsius. He had armed it with a flick of his thumb, feeling the activation sequence complete with a vibration that traveled up his arm. "For the team," he had whispered, and he had pressed the charge against the anchor line. The Jorōgumo had reached him in the same instant, her beak-like chelicerae closing around his shoulder, with a pressure that made his vision explode into white-hot stars. But she had been too late. The thermite had ignited with a flash that was brighter than the sun, a magnesium-white conflagration that consumed the anchor line in a fraction of a second and sent a shockwave of heat and pressure through the entire web. The house had screamed. Not the creature. The house itself. The silk that formed its walls and floors and ceilings had convulsed as the primary support dissolved, the entire structure shifting and buckling as the geometry that held it together surrendered to gravity and chaos. The floor of the pantry had tilted, tilting further, becoming a slope that became a wall that became a ceiling as the house rotated around the void where the anchor had been. Kaido had fallen. He had fallen through the dissolving webs, through the screaming cocoons, through the fragments of architecture that were no longer held together by anything but momentum and memory. The Jorōgumo's grip had been torn loose by the violence of the collapse, her legs flailing against the silk that was no longer solid, her human face contorted in an expression that might have been rage or might have been grief. She had reached for him with one hand, her fingers brushing his ankle with a touch that burned like frostbite, and then he had been beyond her reach, tumbling through the darkness toward the roar of the waterfall below. The impact had been water, not stone. The house had been suspended over the waterfall's pool, and Kaido had plunged into the churning froth with a force that drove the air from his lungs and sent him spinning in a vortex of bubbles and pressure. He had struck the bottom, felt the soft mud of the pool bed beneath his boots, and kicked upward with a strength born of pure survival instinct, his arms flailing, his mouth sealed against the water that tried to force its way into his throat. He had breached the surface in a burst of spray and gasping breath, his hands finding purchase on a rock at the pool's edge, his body hauling itself onto dry land with movements that were more convulsion than climbing. He had lain on the stones, his face pressed against the cold, wet surface, vomiting water and silk, and the acid taste of chemical solvent that had mixed with the Jorōgumo's secretions to create a compound that burned his esophagus with each heave. And above him, the house had fallen. It had not simply collapsed. It had imploded, the impossible geometry collapsing into itself like a dying star, the silk igniting in patches where the thermite had scattered its burning fragments. The fire had been white, blinding, consuming the webs and the cocoons and the architecture of centuries in a purification that was as beautiful as it was terrible. Kaido had watched through streaming eyes, his body broken and bleeding and somehow still alive, as the Jorōgumo's lair had been consumed by the inferno. The creature had emerged from the flames. Not fleeing, not dying, emerging. Her body had been wreathed in white fire, the silk burning away from her segmented form in sheets of ash and smoke, and she had crawled from the wreckage of her house with a determination that suggested immortality was not merely a metaphor. Her human torso had been charred, the white kimono reduced to blackened rags, and several of her legs had been damaged, hanging limp or bent at angles that suggested broken joints. But she had been alive. She had been moving, and she had been looking directly at Kaido with eyes that still glowed with an internal fire that matched the external conflagration. "This is not over," she had said, and her voice had emerged from a throat that was half burned, half intact, a ruin that still managed to convey absolute certainty. "I am the web. I am the story. I am the song that plays in the dark. You cannot burn a story, little hunter. You can only delay its telling." She had raised one damaged foreleg, the chitinous point gleaming in the firelight, and Kaido had known with absolute certainty that she was about to strike, that she was about to end his life with the same casual precision that she had used to collect his teammates. But the damaged leg had trembled, faltered, and then, with a sound like dry wood snapping, it had separated from her body, falling to the stones beside the pool with a wet thud. The Jorōgumo had stared at the severed appendage with an expression that might have been surprise. Then the fire had consumed her, the thermite's residual heat reaching a critical temperature that overwhelmed even her regenerative capabilities, and she had retreated into the burning wreckage of her house, her form dissolving into smoke and steam, and the shrill, harmonic scream of a biwa string breaking under too much tension. Kaido had lain on the stones and watched the house burn until the fire had consumed everything that could burn, until the silk had been reduced to ash that floated on the waterfall's mist like snow, until the only sound had been the endless roar of water and the pounding of his own damaged heart. He had been found 3 days later by a rescue team that had been dispatched when Slayer 6 had failed to report. They had pulled him from the riverbed approximately 2 kilometers downstream from the waterfall, his body wedged between boulders, his lungs half filled with water, his skin covered in chemical burns and silk, residue that the medical examiners would later catalog with the clinical detachment of professionals who had never seen anything like it and hoped they never would again. The debriefing had taken 2 weeks. The doctors had treated his burns, extracted the silk fibers from his respiratory system, monitored his vital signs for signs of psychological trauma that went beyond the expected range of PTSD. They had been thorough. They had been professional. They had been kind. And now Kaito sat in the sterile room, staring at the severed spider leg that twitched on the table before him, smelling the copper and rotted orchids that rose from his own healing skin, listening to the music that played in the spaces between his thoughts. "Sergeant Tanaka," the voice from the speaker repeated, more insistent now, "we need you to complete your account. What happened after the house collapsed?" Kaito looked at the leg. It twitched again, longer this time, the spasm traveling its full length in a wave that was almost deliberate. The doctors had said it was nerve reaction, post-mortem twitching, meaningless biological noise. But Kaito knew better. He knew that the Jorōgumo was not dead. She was diminished, damaged, driven deep into the earth by fire and acid and the hubris of a man who had refused to become her masterpiece. But she was not dead. She was listening. She was remembering. She was weaving. "She's still out there," Kaito said, his voice barely audible above the hum of the fluorescent lights. "Who is still out there, Sergeant?" "The Jorōgumo, the spider, the woman in the white kimono. She's still out there, and she's still weaving." A pause, the hiss of static. Then, "Sergeant Tanaka, the search teams found no evidence of any surviving entity. The house was completely destroyed. The thermite charge incinerated the structure and any biological material within it. There is no spider. There is no threat. You are safe." Kaito laughed. The sound emerged from his throat like broken glass, sharp and painful and utterly devoid of humor. "Safe," he repeated. "You think I'm safe. You think any of us are safe." He reached out and touched the severed leg, his fingers brushing against the chitinous surface with a gentleness that was half reverence, half horror. The leg spasmed under his touch, the fine hairs bristling in a wave that traveled from base to tip, and Kaito felt something. A vibration, a frequency, a communication too subtle for conscious processing but undeniable in its presence. "She's singing to me," he whispered, his eyes unfocusing, his consciousness drifting toward the music that had never stopped, that would never stop, that was playing now in the space behind his eyes with a clarity that made the fluorescent lights seem dim by comparison. "She's singing the song of the web, the song of the tapestry, and she's telling me that she's almost ready to begin again." "Sergeant Tanaka, you're not making sense." "No," Kaito agreed, his voice dreamy, distant, already half absorbed into the music. "I'm not making sense. I'm making silk, and soon, very soon, the silk will be all that's left." He looked down at his arm, at the chemical burn that decorated his skin in patterns of blistered tissue and weeping sores. The wound was healing, the doctors had said. The skin was regenerating. The nerve damage was minimal. But Kaito could see the changes that the doctors could not. The way the new skin was slightly translucent, slightly iridescent, slightly wrong. The way the pores seemed to be sealing themselves, not with scar tissue but with something finer, something silkier, something that caught the light and refracted it into colors that had no names in human languages. The Jorōgumo had touched him, not just physically in the moment of their final confrontation, but spiritually, psychologically, in the depths of his mind where she had planted seeds that were now germinating in the warm darkness of his consciousness. She had promised to weave him into her tapestry. And though the house had burned and the webs had dissolved, and the creature herself had been driven into the earth by fire and iron will, the weaving had never stopped. "The leg is twitching," Kaito said, his fingers still resting on the chitinous surface. "We know, Sergeant," the doctors explained. "No," Kaido's voice sharpened, cutting through the speaker's professional patience with an edge of genuine terror. "You don't understand. It's not twitching because of nerve reaction. It's twitching because she's moving it. She's reaching through it. She's using it as a thread." He looked up at the ceiling, at the corners of the room where the walls met in angles that seemed slightly wrong, slightly acute, slightly suggestive of webs rather than architecture. And he saw them, the filaments, so fine they were barely visible, drifting in the air currents created by the ventilation system, settling on the furniture, on the floor, on his skin. "She's already here," Kaido whispered. "She's been here since they brought me back. She's been weaving this room, this building, this city. She's been patient. She's been careful. She's been waiting for the right moment to pull the thread." "Sergeant Tanaka, I need you to calm down." "I am calm." And strangely, he was. The terror had passed through him and emerged on the other side as something else. Acceptance, perhaps, or resignation, or the simple recognition that some battles could not be won, only endured. "I'm telling you this because someone needs to know. Someone needs to remember when I'm gone that the Jorōgumo is not a creature. She's a story, and stories don't die. They change. They adapt. They find new throats to speak through, new minds to inhabit, new webs to weave." He stood up, his chair scraping against the floor with a sound that was louder than it should have been, and he walked to the door of the debriefing room. The guards outside looked at him with expressions of professional concern, their hands hovering near their weapons, their body language radiating the tension of men who had been briefed on his condition and were not certain what to expect. "I'm done," Kaido said, and the words were not an announcement to the guards but a statement to the universe, a declaration of surrender that was also, paradoxically, a declaration of defiance. "I'm done fighting. I'm done running. I'm done pretending that I can escape a story that has been telling itself for 400 years. He walked past the guards down the corridor toward the exit that led to the city beyond. And as he walked, he listened. To the music, to the silk, to the clicking of spinnerets that only he could hear, spinning threads that only he could see, weaving a pattern that was older than civilization and would outlast it by millennia. The Jorōgumo was not dead. She was patient. She was eternal. She was the story that humans told themselves in the dark, the explanation for disappearances and deaths and the hollow spaces in families where loved ones had once existed. And Kaido, walking out into the sunlight with the smell of copper and rotted orchids rising from his skin, and the music of the biwa playing in his mind, was her newest thread. He would not be the last. The silk was already spreading. The tapestry was growing. And somewhere in a house that should not exist, perched over a waterfall that had no name, the Jorōgumo was weaving. The song would never end. The weight of a single breath. The man stood on the clover and felt nothing. He looked down at his feet, at the heavy leather boots that had carried him across 3 continents and through a dozen field seasons, and he observed with a detached, clinical interest that not a single blade of grass was bent beneath his weight. The clover was lush and green, a carpet of trifoliate leaves that should have compressed under 200 pounds of anthropologist, should have bruised and broken and released the sweet, crushed scent of chlorophyll and sap. But the leaves remained upright, unblemished, perfectly arranged, as if the man were standing on a photograph of clover rather than the thing itself. He felt weightless, or rather he felt that the earth had forgotten him, that gravity had made an exception, a notation in the margins of physical law that read, "This one does not count." He looked up and the Qilin was there. It had not approached, had not made a sound, had not disturbed the air with its passage, because the Qilin did not move in the way that things move. It simply was, first absent and then present, a towering silhouette of white fire and iridescent scales that blocked the sun and turned the valley into a place of shadows and silver light. It was beautiful. That was the first thought that entered the man's mind, the reflexive aesthetic judgment of a species that had evolved to find symmetry and luminescence attractive, to respond to the play of light on surface with a pleasure that was hardwired into the visual cortex. The Qilin was beautiful in the way that a glacier is beautiful, or a lightning strike, or the calm surface of a sea that conceals a trench miles deep. It was beautiful, and it was looking at him with an expression of profound, ancient disgust. The man's name was Dr. Richard Halloran, and he was a corporate developer specializing in ecotourism infrastructure. A man who had built glass and steel resorts in the Maldives and ski lodges in the Alps and jungle retreats in Costa Rica. A man who understood the value of untouched land, not as a sanctuary, but as a commodity, a blank canvas waiting for the brushstrokes of profit. He had come to the Silent Valley as part of a high-end expedition, a group of 12 individuals who had paid exorbitant fees to experience what the brochures called the last pristine ecosystem on Earth, a place where the air was said to be cleaner than any laboratory standard, and the water purer than any filtration system could produce. The valley was located in a remote province of East Asia, protected by mountains on 3 sides and a river on the 4th, accessible only by a treacherous footpath that had been carved into the cliff face by monks in the 6th century, and maintained since then by a succession of caretakers who claimed descent from the original builders. The caretakers called themselves the Keepers of the Taboo, and they had met the expedition at the entrance to the valley with expressions that were not welcoming but resigned, the faces of people who have witnessed the same mistake repeated 1,000 times and have learned that warning is futile, that the arrogant will always find a way to trigger the catastrophe. The head keeper, a woman in her 80s whose face was a topography of wrinkles that mapped the decades of her vigil, had spoken to them in a dialect that the translator struggled with, her voice soft and melodious and utterly without inflection. "The valley is a sanctuary of absolute stillness," she had said, her eyes moving across the faces of the 12 visitors with a gaze that seemed to weigh them, to measure the mass of their egos and the volume of their intentions. To enter, one must move with humility and leave no trace. The taboo of impact is absolute. The grass must not bend. The water must not ripple. The air must not tremble with your noise. To violate the taboo is to invite the attention of the guardian, and the guardian does not forgive. Halloran had smiled when she said this, the same smile he used in boardrooms when dealing with local protesters and environmental activists, a smile that conveyed patience and understanding while communicating contempt. He had heard similar warnings in a dozen countries, had sat through 100 ceremonies of blessing and purification, had learned to nod and bow and make the appropriate donations while his engineers surveyed the land and his lawyers drafted the contracts. The guardian, he assumed, was a marketing device, a legend concocted by the caretakers to justify their monopoly on the valley and to extract higher fees from the tourists. He had no use for guardians, for taboos, for the superstitions of primitive people who had not yet learned to monetize their natural resources. The expedition had consisted of Halloran, 2 other developers from competing firms, a team of 4 biologists who had been hired to produce the environmental impact assessment that would justify the construction permits, a photographer, a journalist, a retired judge who had been invited as a figurehead of respectability, and 2 graduate students who were writing dissertations on sacred geography. They were not humble people. They were successful people, accomplished people, people who had learned to move through the world with the confidence of those who had never been told no, and the concept of moving with humility was as foreign to them as the concept of moving backward. They talked loudly, they gestured broadly, they trampled the undergrowth beneath their imported hiking boots, and they laughed at the keepers who followed them with baskets, picking up the litter of their passage, smoothing the grass they had flattened, whispering apologies to the earth in a language that the visitors did not bother to learn. Sean was one of the biologists, a man in his 30s who had been disgraced not by fraud but by refusal, by a principled stand against a pharmaceutical company that had wanted him to falsify data about the extinction risk of a rare orchid. He had lost his tenure, his funding, his reputation, and had spent the 2 years since wandering from one temporary contract to another, taking whatever fieldwork he could get, trying to rebuild a career that had been demolished by his own integrity. He was quiet, observant, uncomfortable in the company of the developers and the other scientists who seemed to view the valley as a resource to be exploited rather than a miracle to be preserved. He had noticed things that the others had not. The way the insects avoided the expedition, flying in wide arcs around them as if repelled by an invisible barrier. The way the birds stopped singing when the developers raised their voices. The way the wind itself seemed to hesitate before touching their skin, as if reluctant to carry their scent into the deeper parts of the valley. May was the guide's apprentice, a girl of 19 who had been born in the valley and had never left it, who spoke the language of the keepers with a fluency that suggested she thought in its syllables rather than translating from some other tongue. She was small and fierce, with a face that was usually expressionless but that occasionally revealed flashes of emotion that were too complex for the visitors to read. A tightening of the lips that might have been anger or fear, a widening of the eyes that might have been wonder or warning. She had attached herself to Sean on the second day, not out of affection but out of recognition, because she saw in him something that she did not see in the others, a hesitation, a doubt, a willingness to listen that the others lacked. She had tried to tell him about the taboo, about the guardian, about the Qilin that watched over the valley and judged the worth of every creature that entered. But her English was imperfect, and her concepts were ancient, and Sean had understood only fragments, enough to know that something was wrong but not enough to understand the depth of the wrongness until it was too late. The catalyst came on the third day, in the hour before dawn when the valley was at its most silent, its most still, its most vulnerable. Halloran had grown impatient with the caretakers' restrictions, with their insistence on slow movement and quiet speech, and the prohibition against taking samples of the soil or the water or the vegetation. He wanted data, hard data, geological and biological information that would allow him to present a development proposal to the board of directors, and the caretaker's rules were interfering with his schedule. So in the darkness of the early morning, while the others slept in the tents that had been pitched in a meadow near the valley's entrance, Halloran had crept to the equipment cache and retrieved the sonic drilling device that he had smuggled into the expedition despite the caretakers' explicit prohibition against mechanical excavation. The drill was a heavy-duty industrial tool, a cylinder of carbon steel and tungsten carbide powered by a lithium battery that could operate for 6 hours on a single charge. It was designed to extract core samples from bedrock, to penetrate the earth with high-frequency vibrations that pulverized the material in its path and ejected it in a tube of compressed plastic. Halloran had used it 100 times in 100 locations, had drilled into the permafrost of Siberia and the coral reefs of the South Pacific and the volcanic soils of Hawaii, and he had never encountered a substrate that the drill could not penetrate. He had no reason to believe that the soil of the Silent Valley would be any different. He carried the drill to a spot that he had selected the previous afternoon, a flat area of bare earth surrounded by a ring of ancient stones that the caretakers had identified as a meditation site, a place where the monks of the 6th century had sat in silence and communed with the guardian. The stones were arranged in a spiral pattern that led inward to a central point, and Halloran had assumed, in the arrogance of his materialism, that the spiral was decorative, a primitive attempt at landscape architecture that had no significance beyond the aesthetic. He did not know that the spiral was a map, a representation of the valley's energy flows, a diagram of the currents that moved beneath the surface like blood through veins, and that the central point was not empty but occupied, filled with a colony of microscopic organisms that were not bacteria or fungi or any form of life recognized by modern taxonomy, but something older. Something that the caretakers called the spirit insects, the guardians of the guardian, the microscopic sentinels that maintained the balance of the valley's ecosystem, and served as the Qilin's eyes and ears in the world of the small. Halloran set the drill on the bare earth at the center of the spiral, and he powered it on. The noise was deafening, a high-pitched whine that cut through the silence of the dawn like a blade through silk, shattering the stillness into 1,000 jagged pieces. The sonic vibrations traveled downward through the soil, through the layers of loam and clay and subsoil, through the root systems of plants that had not been disturbed in 1,000 years, and they reached the colony of spirit insects in the fraction of a second that it took for the drill bit to penetrate the first inch of earth. The displacement was catastrophic. The drill crushed millions of the organisms, pulverized their delicate structures, destroyed the network of chemical signals that had connected them in a web of communication and mutual aid that spanned the entire valley. The sin was not the noise, though the noise was bad enough. The sin was the displacement, the act of crushing something that had been protected for millennia, the violation of a sanctuary that was not human and had never invited human attention. Sean woke to the sound of the drill, and his first thought was that the valley itself was screaming. He stumbled from his tent, pulling on his boots with shaking hands, and saw Halloran bent over the drill with a look of concentration that was almost sexual, a look of pure, unadulterated focus on the task of penetration, of entry, of violation. Sean ran toward him, shouting for him to stop, but the drill was too loud, the whine too piercing, and Halloran did not hear him or pretended not to hear, or simply did not care. And then, as Sean was still 20 feet away, the drill bit broke through into a cavity beneath the surface, a hollow space that was not a cave or a sinkhole but something else, something that should not have been there. And the whine of the drill changed pitch, dropping from a scream to a groan, and the ground beneath Halloran's feet began to glow. It was not a light in the normal sense, not the illumination of fire or electricity or bioluminescence, but a radiance that seemed to come from the earth itself, from the particles of soil and stone and root that were suddenly suffused with a white fire that was cold and hot simultaneously, that burned without consuming, that revealed without explaining. The glow spread outward from the drill site in a wave that traveled across the meadow and into the forest and up the sides of the mountains, and everywhere it touched, the vegetation responded, the flowers opening their petals wider than they should have been able to, the trees straightening their trunks as if saluting, the grass rising to its full height and trembling with a vibration that was not wind but welcome, or warning or grief. Halloran looked up from the drill, his face illuminated by the white fire, and for the first time since Sean had met him, the developer looked uncertain. The confidence was gone, replaced by a confusion that was almost childlike, the look of a man who has opened a door expecting a closet and found a cathedral instead. He looked at Sean, and his mouth moved, forming words that were lost in the dying whine of the drill, and then he looked down at his feet, at the clover that was suddenly lush and green and perfect beneath him, and he noticed, as Sean had noticed, that he was standing on it without bending a single blade. And then the Qilin was there. It had not run, had not flown, had not materialized from the air in any way that Sean's eyes could track. It was simply present, a towering figure of white fire and iridescent scales that stood between Halloran and the forest, its head lowered, its gaze fixed on the developer with an expression that Sean could only describe as disgust, though disgust was too human a word, too small, too recent. It was the look of a judge who has examined the evidence and found the defendant guilty of a crime that predates the law, a crime against the fundamental order of existence, against the balance that had been established before the first cell divided and the first thought formed. It was the look of ancient authority confronted with modern arrogance, and it was terrifying because it was not angry. Anger would have been understandable, forgivable, human. This was something else, something that operated on a scale of judgment that had no appeal, no parole, no possibility of redemption. The Qilin was the size of an elephant, or perhaps larger, its body elongated and sinuous like a deer's, but scaled in plates that shimmered with colors Sean had no names for, hues that existed in the spaces between blue and violet, between gold and green, colors that seemed to shift with every beat of his heart. Its head was crowned with antlers that were not bone but fire, white fire that burned with a cold intensity and branched into patterns that suggested galaxies, neural networks, the dendritic structures of a mind that was not a mind but a force. Its eyes were not eyes but openings, windows into a space that was not space, depths that drew the gaze inward and downward and through, into a realm where the laws of physics were suggestions rather than rules, and the concept of mercy had never been invented. And its feet. Sean's eyes were drawn to its feet, to the hooves that were not hooves but rounded, cushioned pads that pressed against the earth with a gentleness that was supernatural, that distributed the creature's immense weight across a surface area so broad that not a single blade of grass was crushed, not a single pebble displaced, not a single grain of soil shifted from its position. The Qilin moved and the world did not notice. It stepped forward and the earth accepted its passage as it accepted the passage of the wind, without resistance, without memory, without mark. Halloran screamed. It was the first sound he had made since the drill stopped, a high, tearing shriek that was the product of a lifetime of suppressed fear suddenly released in a single burst of terror. He backed away from the Qilin, his hands raised in a gesture that was part ward and part plea, and he stumbled over the drill, falling backward onto the clover. And the Qilin looked down at him with the same expression of disgust, the same ancient judgment, and it moved again. And this time its movement was not gentle. The hoof came down, not on Halloran but beside him, and the impact was not physical but spatial, a distortion in the fabric of reality that traveled through the ground and into the developer's body with a force that shattered his bones without touching his skin. Sean watched in horror as Halloran's body convulsed, his limbs flailing in a pattern that was not under his control, his spine arching backward until his head touched his heels, his mouth opening in a scream that had no sound because the air around him had been compressed into a vacuum by the Qilin's strike. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the convulsion stopped, and Halloran lay still, his body twisted into a knot that was not quite dead and not quite alive, a piece of biological material that had been judged and found wanting. The Qilin turned. Its gaze swept across the meadow, across the tents where the other members of the expedition were emerging, sleepy and confused, and only beginning to understand that something had changed, that the rules of their world had been rewritten in a language they could not read. And Sean saw the transformation, saw the shift from benevolence to terror that the caretakers had warned about, the moment when the guardian ceased to be a protector and became a predator. The white fire that surrounded the Qilin did not dim, but its quality changed, shifting from the warmth of a hearth to the coldness of a surgical lamp, from the softness of moonlight to the harshness of an interrogator's bulb. The scales stopped shimmering and began to pulse, each plate emitting a rhythmic glow that synchronized with a frequency Sean could feel in his teeth, in his bones, in the fluid of his inner ear. It began to hunt, not with hunger, not with the desperate urgency of a starving animal, but with a precision that was divine, a surgical level of efficiency that selected targets based on criteria Sean could not perceive but could infer. The first to die was one of the other developers, a woman named Patricia who had been filming the expedition with a drone and who had made the mistake of launching the device into the air above the Qilin. The mechanical whir of its rotors an insult that could not be tolerated. The Qilin moved, and its movement was silent, absolutely silent, a displacement of space that left no sonic signature, no disturbance in the air, and Patricia was suddenly 20 feet in the air, not flying but suspended, her body held by an invisible force that compressed her chest until her ribs snapped and her lungs collapsed and her eyes bulged from their sockets in a look of surprise that mirrored Halloran's. She hung there for a moment, a rag doll in the grip of a god, and then she fell, not dropped but placed, her body deposited on the grass with a gentleness that was more horrible than a violent impact would have been, and the grass beneath her remained unbent, untouched, perfect. The others ran. Of course they ran. They were human beings confronted with a power that exceeded their comprehension, and the only response their nervous systems could generate was flight, the ancient imperative to escape, to survive, to put distance between themselves and the predator. But the valley was a closed system, a bowl surrounded by mountains, and the Qilin did not need to chase them. It simply was where they were going, appearing in their path with a spatial validity that defied physics, standing between them and the exit with a patience that suggested it had all the time in the world, which it did, because it was older than the valley, older than the mountains, older than the tectonic plates that had collided to form the basin in which the valley rested. The biologist named Chen was next, a man who had spent the morning collecting soil samples with a spade, digging holes in the earth, with the same casual violence that Halloran had exhibited with the drill. The Qilin appeared beside him as he ran, and its antlers swept down, not touching him but passing through him, and Chen stopped mid-stride, his body freezing in a posture of flight that became a posture of paralysis, and Sean saw the man's face age in seconds, the skin wrinkling, the hair whitening, the muscles atrophying as if time had been accelerated within his body, as if the Qilin's passage had stolen not his life but his future, collapsing decades into moments and leaving behind a husk that looked like a mummy from an ancient tomb. Chen fell, or rather he crumbled, his desiccated body disintegrating into dust and fragments that settled on the grass without disturbing a single blade. The photographer died trying to climb a tree, his hands torn by the bark, his nails broken and bleeding, and the Qilin did not even approach him. It simply looked at him from 50 feet away, and the tree responded, its branches bending with a flexibility that wood should not possess, wrapping around the man's body and squeezing with a pressure that crushed his ribs and forced the breath from his lungs in a final, bubbling gasp. The journalist was pierced by a root that erupted from the ground beneath her feet, a wooden spear that impaled her through the abdomen and lifted her into the air like a flag on a pole, her blood running down the root and into the soil where it was absorbed without leaving a stain. The retired judge was simply erased, one moment standing and the next moment absent, a space in the air where a man had been, and Sean could not tell whether he had been destroyed or transported or simply unmade, reduced to the fundamental particles that had been temporarily assembled into the illusion of a person. Sean ran. He ran not toward the exit but away from it, not because he thought he could escape, but because the direction did not matter, because the Qilin was everywhere and nowhere, because the valley had become a trap with no door, and the only variable was the manner of death, not its avoidance. He ran through the forest, his boots pounding against the earth, his breath tearing from his lungs in ragged gasps, and behind him he could feel the presence of the creature, not as a sound or a sight but as a pressure, a weight on his consciousness that made his thoughts slow and his vision blur. He ran until his legs gave out, until he collapsed against a tree trunk that was warm and alive and somehow aware of him, and he waited for the end, for the hoof that would compress his spine, for the antler that would steal his years, for the gaze that would erase him from existence. But the end did not come. He sat against the tree, gasping, weeping, his body shaking with adrenaline and exhaustion, and the Qilin did not appear. The pressure remained, the weight of its attention like a hand on the back of his neck, but it did not strike, did not approach, did not deliver the judgment that it had delivered to the others. Sean did not understand why. He did not know that the Qilin's culling was based on weight, on impact, on the moral and physical footprint that each human left on the land, and that his footprint, though not zero, was smaller than the others, that his hesitation before the drill, his attempt to stop Halloran, his years of principled refusal to exploit the natural world, had accumulated into a ledger entry that was not positive, but was at least less negative than the developers and the biologists who had dug and sampled and taken without asking. He did not know this, but May did. She found him an hour later, or what felt like an hour, crawling through the undergrowth with a silence that was not trained but instinctive, the silence of someone who had grown up in the valley and understood its rhythms, its moods, its rules. She pressed a finger to his lips before he could speak, and her eyes warned him of what her voice could not. Do not make a sound, do not move, do not attract the attention of the thing that is still hunting, still judging, still cleansing the valley of the stain of human arrogance. They huddled together against the tree, two survivors in a valley that had become an abattoir, and May whispered into Sean's ear with a breath so light it barely stirred the air. "It is not finished," she said. "The Qilin does not hunt with hunger, it hunts to cleanse. It removes the weight, the impact, the damage, but it is not a mindless force. It is grieving. The drill destroyed the colony, the spirit insects, the eyes of the guardian. The Qilin is not just angry. Its heart is broken, and a creature with a broken heart is the most dangerous thing in the world, because it has nothing left to lose." Sean looked at her, and in her face he saw a knowledge that was older than her years, a wisdom that had been passed down through generations of keepers and apprentices, and he understood that May was not just a guide but a priestess, a mediator between the human and the divine, and that her presence was the only reason he was still alive. "What do we do?" he whispered, his voice barely audible, a thread of sound that was swallowed by the silence of the valley. May closed her eyes and her lips moved in a silent prayer, or perhaps a memory, and when she opened her eyes again there was a light in them that was not hope but determination, not faith but duty. "We atone," she said. "We show the Qilin that we understand what we have broken and we try to mend it, but the path is dangerous. The Qilin cannot be fought, only mirrored. To calm a creature that treads without weight, we must prove that we are capable of the same gentleness. We must cross the valley without treading. We must reach the center of the impact, the place where the drill entered the earth, and we must offer something that the Qilin will accept as payment for the life that was lost. Something of ourselves, something irreplaceable." Sean nodded, though he did not understand, though the task seemed impossible, though every instinct in his body screamed at him to run, to hide, to survive by any means necessary. He nodded because May was the only authority left in a world that had been stripped of rules, because the Qilin was still out there, still grieving, still hunting, and because the only alternative to atonement was annihilation. They waited for the darkness, for the moment when the Qilin's rage might ease into a different phase, a mourning rather than a cleansing. And as they waited, Sean looked at the valley around him and saw it as it truly was, not as a resource or a tourist destination or a research site, but as a sanctuary, a place where the ordinary rules of existence had been suspended in favor of a deeper order, an older covenant between the living and the land. He saw the grass that had not bent beneath Halloran's feet, the clover that had remained perfect beneath the Qilin's hooves, the water that had not rippled when the creature passed, and he understood that the taboo of impact was not superstition but physics, not religion but ecology, a law of nature that the valley enforced with the same rigor that gravity enforced the fall of apples. And he understood, with a sinking heart, that he was about to be tested on that law, tested in a way that would require him to unlearn everything he knew about movement, about weight, about the fundamental relationship between his body and the earth that supported it. He was going to have to walk without walking, to move without moving, to become as light as the Qilin itself, and the prospect filled him with a terror that was almost as great as the terror of the creature itself, because he did not know if he was capable of such gentleness, such humility, such absolute surrender of the ego that demanded to leave its mark on everything it touched. The darkness came, and the valley changed. The white fire of the Qilin had retreated to a distant part of the forest, a pulsing glow that was visible through the trees like a lighthouse seen from a storm-tossed sea. And the silence deepened, becoming not merely the absence of sound but a positive force, a pressure that pushed against the eardrums and made the blood rush in Sean's ears. May stood up from their hiding place, her movements so slow that they seemed to be happening underwater, and she extended her hand to Sean, not as a gesture of intimacy but as an offer of guidance, a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. "Follow me," she mouthed, her lips forming the words without releasing them into the air. "Follow me and do not touch the living earth. Step only on stone, on dead wood, on the bones of the forest. Do not bend the grass. Do not bruise the moss. Do not leave a trace. The Qilin is watching, even now, even in its grief, and a single mistake will be enough to draw its attention, to trigger its rage, to end our hope." Sean took her hand, and together they began to move through the valley of silence, two ghosts in a world of the living, and behind them the white fire pulsed, and above them the stars watched, and ahead of them the impact site waited, a wound in the earth that could only be healed by the offering of blood and the sacrifice of weight. The clearing was a perfect circle, a disk of scorched earth that had been burned white by the passage of the Qilin's hooves, and Sean stood at its edge with May pressed against his side, her small body trembling with a fear that she would not voice but could not hide. The scorching was not fire in the normal sense, not the blackening and charring of organic material by combustion, but a bleaching, a removal of color and life and possibility from the soil until it looked like bone, like ash, like the residue of a star that had burned out and collapsed into a cold, dense remnant of its former radiance. The circle was perhaps 50 feet in diameter, and inside it nothing grew, nothing moved, nothing lived. The grass that had been lush and green on the outside of the perimeter was gray and brittle on the inside, not burned but drained, as if the Qilin's passage had sucked the vitality from the earth itself, had left behind a wound that was not physical but essential, a hole in the world where the concept of growth had been erased. Sean stepped forward, placing his foot on the scorched earth, and felt a sensation that was not pain but absence, a numbness that traveled up his leg and into his spine, a disconnection from the earth that was more profound than mere physical separation. The ground beneath his boot was fragile, glassy, crystalline, and he could feel it cracking beneath his weight, microfractures spreading outward from his heel in a pattern that was almost beautiful, like frost on a window pane, like the dendritic structures of a neural network dying in slow motion. He pulled his foot back, retreating to the safety of the unburned grass, and looked at May with an expression that was equal parts awe and terror. "It's glass," he whispered, his voice barely stirring the air, afraid that even a whisper might trigger some new catastrophe, might attract the attention of the creature that was still hunting somewhere in the valley, still grieving, still burning with a rage that was indistinguishable from sorrow. "The ground has turned to glass. The Qilin's presence is crystallizing the soil, transforming it into something that can't support life. The whole valley is becoming fragile." May nodded, her eyes fixed on the scorched circle with a gaze that was not horrified but resigned, the look of someone who has seen this before, who has watched the Guardian's passage transform sanctuary into wasteland, and knows that the process is not yet complete, that the worst is still to come. "The Qilin is not just angry," she said, her voice so soft that Sean had to lean closer to hear, so close that he could smell the scent of her hair, of herbs and smoke and the mineral tang of the valley's water. "It is trying to undo the damage. It is burning the earth to purify it, to remove the contamination of the drill, to sterilize the wound. But it does not understand that the fire is worse than the drill, that the cure is killing the patient. It is a creature of balance, and the balance has been broken, and now it is swinging wildly between extremes, trying to find a center that no longer exists." Sean looked at the scorched earth, at the glassy surface that reflected the sky in a distorted, funhouse mirror, and he understood what May meant. The Qilin was not malevolent. It was not evil. It was a doctor who had discovered that the patient was infected, and was now amputating limbs in a frenzy of surgical intervention, removing the healthy tissue along with the diseased, burning the village to save it from the plague. They had seen the culling continue as they moved through the valley, had watched from hiding places in the undergrowth as the Qilin delivered its judgments with a precision that was more terrible than any indiscriminate slaughter could have been. The creature did not rage blindly through the forest, destroying everything in its path. It selected, it targeted, it weighed the moral and physical impact of each human being and delivered a sentence that was tailored to the specific sin, the specific weight, the specific footprint that the individual had left on the land. The developer who had argued most loudly for the construction permits, a man named Kowalski who had boasted about the helicopter pads and the infinity pools, had been lifted into the canopy by an invisible force and deposited among the branches of an ancient oak. His body folded and twisted until his spine had snapped in 3 places, and he had hung there for hours, dying slowly, while the Qilin stood at the base of the tree and watched, its head tilted in an attitude of evaluation, as if studying the effects of its handiwork and finding them insufficient. The biologist who had taken the most samples, a woman named Okonkwo who had filled her backpack with pressed flowers and soil tubes and insect specimens, had been buried alive, the earth beneath her feet suddenly becoming fluid, swallowing her up to her neck in a matter of seconds, and then solidifying again, leaving her trapped with her head protruding from the ground like a post, her mouth open in a scream that had no sound because the soil had compressed her chest and prevented her lungs from expanding. The Qilin had stood over her for a long time, its white fire dimming and brightening in a pattern that might have been mourning and might have been satisfaction, and then it had moved on, leaving Okonkwo to die of thirst and exposure, a human flower pressed into the earth that she had violated. The photographer, the journalist, the judge, the graduate students, the other developer, all had been judged, all had been sentenced, all had been executed with a deliberation that was more horrible than any chaotic massacre could have been because it suggested not madness but method, not rage but principle. The Qilin was cleansing the valley, removing the human stain one person at a time, and Sean and May were the only ones left, the only survivors of the expedition that had entered the valley as conquerors and was now being expelled as contaminants, purged from the ecosystem with the same efficiency that a white blood cell purges a virus from a bloodstream. But Sean had noticed something else, something that May had hinted at, and that his own observations confirmed. The Qilin was not just killing, it was trying to fix what had been broken. After each execution, the creature returned to the impact site, the place where Halloran had drilled into the earth and destroyed the colony of spirit insects, and it hovered there, its white fire flickering in a rhythmic, mourning pattern that was almost hypnotic in its regularity. Sean had watched from a distance of 200 yards, hidden behind a fallen log, as the Qilin lowered its head to the wound in the earth and breathed upon it, exhaling a stream of white fire that did not burn the soil but transformed it, turning the dark, disrupted earth into a glassy, reflective surface that looked like a mirror embedded in the ground. And after each exhalation, the Qilin would pause, its head cocked, its ears, if they were ears, twitching, as if listening for a response, waiting for the earth to tell it that the healing was working, that the colony was restored, that the balance was returning. But the earth did not respond. The wound remained. The glassy surface reflected only the sky, only the Qilin's own image, only the empty blue of a world that had been stripped of the microscopic lives that had maintained its harmony. And each time the earth failed to respond, the Qilin's fire would dim further, its posture would sag, its antlers would lower until they almost touched the ground, and Sean would feel a wave of emotion radiating from the creature that was not anger but grief, not wrath but despair, a sorrow so vast and so deep that it seemed to bend the air around it, creating gravity wells of sadness that pulled at Sean's heart and made him want to weep for a creature that had just murdered a dozen people. It's grieving, Sean had said to May during one of their brief periods of rest, huddled in a crevice between two boulders where the Qilin's senses could not easily reach them. It's not just punishing us for the drill. It's mourning the insects. It's trying to bring them back, and it can't, and the failure is driving it mad. The benevolence is still there, underneath the rage. It's trying to protect the valley, but it doesn't know how anymore. The rules have changed, and the Qilin is still playing by the old ones, and the old rules are destroying everything. May had looked at him with an expression that was new to her face, an expression that combined surprise with a kind of recognition, as if she had been waiting for him to understand something that she had known since childhood. The Qilin is a creature of balance, she had said. For thousands of years, it has maintained the valley by removing the heavy, the destructive, the unbalanced, but it has never faced a destruction like this. The spirit insects were not just part of the ecosystem. They were the ecosystem. They processed the nutrients, they regulated the temperature, they communicated between the plants and the animals and the soil, creating a network of information that was the valley's true nervous system. Without them, the valley is dying, and the Qilin knows it, and the knowledge is breaking its heart. A creature with a broken heart does not judge fairly. It lashes out. It burns. It destroys everything in the hope that something will grow from the ashes. But ashes do not grow. Ashes only wait. They sat in the crevice as the day wore on, watching the valley change around them. The scorched earth was expanding, the circles of glassy soil merging into larger circles, the boundaries of the Qilin's influence creeping outward like frost on a window, like mold on bread, like the spread of a disease that consumes the healthy tissue along with the sick. The trees that had been green and vibrant in the morning were gray and brittle by noon, their leaves falling in a rain of ash that coated the ground in a layer of gray dust. The stream that had run clear and cold through the center of the valley was thickening, becoming viscous, its water turning to a gel that did not flow but crept, moving with a sluggishness that suggested the death of the current, the end of the hydrological cycle. The birds had stopped singing, the insects had stopped buzzing, and the only sound was the occasional pulse of the Qilin's white fire, a subsonic thrum that traveled through the ground and into their bones, a heartbeat that was irregular, arrhythmic, the heartbeat of a creature in cardiac distress. And the gravity was shifting. Sean noticed it first when he tried to stand and found himself pulled sideways, not downward, his body leaning toward the impact site as if the wound in the earth had become a center of mass, a gravity well that was drawing everything toward it. He had to brace himself against the boulder to maintain his balance, and even then he felt the constant tug, the insistent pull, the sensation that the world had tilted on its axis and was sliding toward the hole that Halloran had drilled. May was affected too, her small body pressed against the rock by a force that she could not see, her hair streaming horizontally toward the impact site as if she were underwater, caught in a current that was sweeping her toward a waterfall. "It's the divine rage," May gasped, her voice strained by the pressure on her chest. "The Qilin's presence is warping the environment. The valley is becoming an extension of its emotions, its grief made physical, its despair given weight. If we stay here, we will be crushed. We will be pulled into the impact site and compressed into the glass, 2 more fossils in the Qilin's monument to loss." Sean nodded, though moving was agony, though every step required him to fight against a gravity that was no longer his ally but his enemy, a force that wanted him to lie down and be still and become part of the valley's death. He pushed against the boulder, against the air, against the weight of the Qilin's sorrow, and he reached for May's hand, and together they emerged from the crevice into a world that was tilting, sliding, falling toward the center. The impact site was visible from everywhere now, not because it was large but because it was bright. A point of white radiance that pierced the gray atmosphere like a star, a beacon that drew the eye and the body and the soul toward itself with an attraction that was magnetic, gravitational, irresistible. Sean could feel it pulling him, could feel his thoughts bending toward it, his memories reorganizing themselves around it. his sense of self thinning and stretching like taffy being pulled toward a point of infinite density. He tried to look away, to focus on May, on the trees, on the ash that was falling like snow, but the impact site demanded attention, demanded worship, demanded sacrifice, and he knew that if they did not reach it soon, if they did not make their offering and attempt their atonement, they would be absorbed by it, transformed into the same glassy material that coated the ground, two more reflective surfaces in which the Qilin could stare and see only its own grief reflected back at it. They moved through the valley with a slowness that was torturous, each step requiring them to lean against the sideways gravity, to push through a medium that had become thick and resistant, like walking through syrup or setting cement. The air itself was changing, becoming viscous, coating their skin with a film that was not sweat but something else, a secretion of the valley's dying ecosystem that felt like oil and smelled like ozone. Sean's lungs burned with the effort of breathing, each inhalation requiring him to suck in a volume of air that seemed to resist entry, that pressed against his diaphragm and made his ribs ache with the strain. And everywhere, the signs of the Qilin's passage. A tree that had been split vertically by a hoof strike, its two halves standing like pillars on either side of a path that led toward the impact site. A boulder that had been compressed into a cube, its crystalline structure reorganized by the application of a force that was not physical but spatial, a rearrangement of the relationships between atoms that had transformed stone into something that looked like metal, like glass, like a material that had no name in human geology. A bird, or the remains of a bird that had been frozen in mid-flight, its wings extended, its beak open, its body transformed into a statue of ash that crumbled when Sean's passage disturbed the air around it, dissolving into a cloud of gray particles that was immediately sucked toward the impact site by the gravity well. They reached the edge of the scorched circle as the sun was setting, or as what passed for sunset in a world where the sky had turned the color of bruised plums, and the light seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The circle was larger than it had been in the morning. Its diameter expanded to encompass the meadow where the tents had been pitched, where Halloran had started the drill, where the expedition had begun its transformation from tourists to penitents. The tents were gone, not burned but absorbed, their synthetic fabrics and aluminum poles converted into the same glassy material that covered the ground, two domes of reflective crystal that looked like igloos built by madmen, like the homes of ice worms on a frozen moon. And in the center of the circle, at the precise point where Halloran had drilled, the Qilin was waiting. It was not hovering, not moving, not burning with the restless energy that had characterized its earlier appearances. It was standing still, its head lowered, its antlers almost touching the glassy surface, its white fire reduced to a dim glow that pulsed in synchrony with a rhythm that Sean recognized as his own heartbeat, or perhaps the valley's heartbeat, or perhaps the heartbeat of the earth itself. The creature was diminished, shrunken, its once towering form now hunched and sagging, its scales dull and lifeless, its eyes, those windows into the infinite, closed or obscured by membranes that looked like the inner eyelids of a sleeping reptile. It was dying. Sean knew this with a certainty that bypassed observation and entered the realm of intuition. The same intuition that had told him not to falsify the orchid data, that had warned him against the pharmaceutical company, that had whispered to him in the darkness of his childhood bedroom that the world was more complex than the adults admitted. The Qilin was dying, not from any external wound but from the internal hemorrhage of its own grief, the slow bleeding out of a spirit that had been tasked with maintaining a balance that was no longer maintainable, that had been asked to heal a wound that was beyond its capacity to close. It was dying, and its death would not be a peaceful passing but a catastrophic collapse, a supernova of divine energy that would consume the valley and everything in it, a final, fiery testament to the fragility of the world beneath its feet. "We have to hurry," May whispered, her voice barely audible above the subsonic thrum that was now audible, a hum that vibrated in Sean's teeth and his sinuses and the fluid of his inner ear. The Qilin is preparing its final strike. It is gathering the last of its energy to burn the valley clean, to reduce everything to ash and glass and start again from zero. If we do not reach it before it releases that energy, we will be vaporized along with everything else. We will become part of the sterilization. Sean nodded, though his body screamed at him to run, to flee, to put as much distance as possible between himself and the dying god in the center of the circle. He nodded because May was right, because there was no escape, because the only way out was through, because the Qilin could not be fought, only mirrored, and the mirroring had to happen now, before the final flame, before the last breath, before the sigh that would end the world. They stepped onto the glassy surface, and Sean felt the fragility beneath his boots, the cracking and splintering of the crystallized soil that threatened to give way with every step, to collapse into the cavity beneath and send them tumbling into the hollow where the spirit insects had lived, where the drill had struck, where the wound was deepest and the healing most needed. He moved with a care that was painful in its intensity, placing each foot on a stone that protruded from the glass, on a fragment of dead wood that had not yet been absorbed, on any surface that could bear his weight without shattering, without bending, without leaving a trace. May moved beside him, her smaller body lighter, her steps more certain, and she guided him with touches and gestures, pointing out the safe paths, the stable stones, the dead branches that would support their passage. But the gravity was stronger here, almost unbearable, a sideways pull that dragged them toward the Qilin with a force that was not violent but insistent, a seduction rather than an assault, a whisper in the bones that said, come closer, come and see, come and be seen, come and offer yourself to the flame. Sean leaned against it. His body angled at 45 degrees to the ground, his muscles trembling with the effort of maintaining his balance, and he focused on May, on her hand in his, on the sound of her breathing that was the only human thing left in a world that had become alien and hostile and divine. They were halfway across the circle when the Qilin stirred. Its head rose slowly with a creaking sound that suggested ancient joints and tired muscles, and its eyes opened, not the windows to infinity but something else, something that was closer to the surface, more personal, more immediate. It saw them. Sean felt the weight of its gaze like a physical pressure, like a hand pressing down on the crown of his head, and he knew that the creature was evaluating them, weighing them, measuring their impact on the valley and their potential for atonement. He felt himself being examined from the inside, his memories rifled through, his intentions laid bare, his soul held up to a light that was not white fire but something else, something that was the color of judgment, the color of truth, the color of the moment when a scale finds its balance. And the Qilin screamed. Not the scream of rage that Sean had heard before, not the cry of a predator or the roar of a destroyer, but a sound that was worse because it was wounded, because it was the scream of a creature that has been hurt beyond healing and knows it, that has lost something irreplaceable and cannot accept the loss, that has reached the end of its endurance and found only more endurance required. The scream was white fire made audible, a vibration that traveled through the glass and into their feet and up their spines and into their skulls, and Sean felt his nose begin to bleed, felt the warm trickle of blood on his upper lip, and he saw that May was bleeding too, from her nose and her ears and the corners of her eyes, and the blood did not fall to the ground but was drawn toward the Qilin, pulled by the gravity well, absorbed by the creature's grief like water into dry earth. The Qilin rose to its full height, and Sean saw that it was larger than he had thought, larger than the valley could contain, its antlers brushing against clouds that were not clouds but the ashes of the burned trees, its hooves pressing against the glass with a force that did not crack it but transformed it, turning the surface beneath its feet into a mirror that reflected not the sky but something else, something that looked like a map of the valley as it had been before the drill, before the fire, before the grief, a map of a world that was green and living and whole. The creature was preparing its final strike, gathering the white fire in its chest, compressing it into a point of absolute intensity that would be released in a single, incinerating pulse, and Sean knew that they had seconds, perhaps less, before the flame came and the valley ended and everything became ash. May dropped to her knees. It was not a fall but a deliberate collapse, a surrender of posture and pride in self, and she pressed her forehead against the glass with a gentleness that was almost a kiss, almost a prayer, almost an apology. "Mirror it," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the thrum of the Qilin's gathering fire. "Do not fight, do not flee, become what it is, become weightless, become harmless. Become pure." Sean looked at her, and then he looked at the Qilin, and he understood. He understood that the creature was not evil, not even angry in the human sense. It was heartbroken. It had lost the spiritinsects, lost the balance, lost the meaning of its existence, and it was lashing out at the only targets available because it did not know how to mourn, because grief had been transformed into rage by the simple chemistry of a spirit that had never been taught to process loss. He sank to his knees beside May, and the glass beneath him cracked, not from his weight but from the tension in his muscles, the resistance that he was still offering, the refusal to fully surrender. He forced himself to relax, to let go, to become as light as the Qilin itself, and the cracking stopped. He pressed his palms against the glass, feeling its coldness, its smoothness, its fragility, and he felt the vibrations of the Qilin's fire through the surface, a trembling that was building toward an explosion. He looked up at the creature, into the windows of its eyes, and he saw not a monster but a gardener who had discovered that his garden had been poisoned, a shepherd who had found his flock slaughtered, a parent who had lost a child and could not comprehend the magnitude of the emptiness. And he knew what he had to do. He knew that the Qilin could not be fought, only mirrored, and that the mirroring required not just stillness and gentleness but sacrifice, an offering of something that was irreplaceable, something that would demonstrate the sincerity of his atonement, the depth of his understanding, the weight of his guilt. He reached into his pocket and found the field knife that he carried for specimen collection, a small blade with a serrated edge and a handle of molded plastic, and he drew it across his palm with a motion that was not violent but surgical, precise, deliberate. The blood welled up, dark and thick, and he turned his hand over and let it drip onto the glass, onto the mirror surface, onto the wound in the earth where the drill had penetrated. Blood did not spread. It pooled, a single perfect circle of crimson that remained intact, that did not run or splatter or diffuse into the surface, and Sean felt something shift in the air, something in the vibration of the Qilin's fire, a hesitation, a pause, a moment of consideration. He pressed his bleeding palm against the glass, feeling the cold surface against his wound, and he spoke, his voice emerging as a croak, a whisper, a thread of sound that was barely audible but absolutely sincere. "I am sorry," he said. "I am sorry for what we did. I am sorry for the drill and the noise and the displacement. I am sorry for the arrogance and the greed and the belief that we had the right to take without asking. I am sorry for the spiritinsects, for the colony, for the balance that we broke. I cannot bring them back, I cannot undo the damage, but I can offer you this, the only thing I have that is mine to give. My blood, my life, my weight, take it all, just stop the fire, just let the valley live." The Qilin looked at him, and the white fire in its chest pulsed, dimmed, brightened, dimmed again. The antlers lowered, the head tilted, the windows of the eyes seemed to narrow, to focus, to see him not as a target but as a person, a human being who was kneeling in the glass with blood on his hand and tears on his face, and a heart that was broken in sympathy with the creature's own broken heart. The fire continued to pulse, building and releasing, and Sean knew that the creature was deciding, weighing, judging, and that the judgment could still go either way, that the sacrifice might be accepted or it might be rejected, that the flame might die or it might consume them all. He waited, May waited, the valley waited, and the Qilin, the ancient guardian of the silent valley, the creature that tread without weight and judged without mercy, hovered on the brink of decision, its fire flickering, its grief trembling, its heart broken and vast and older than the mountains, deciding whether to accept the offering or to end the world. The Qilin did not move. It stood at the center of the glassy circle with its white fire pulsing in a rhythm that had become arrhythmic, a stuttering heartbeat that suggested not strength but exhaustion, not power but the last reserves of a spirit that had been burning too brightly for too long. Sean knelt with his bleeding palm pressed against the mirror surface, feeling the cold glass against his wound, feeling his blood pool in the cracks and fissures that radiated outward from the impact site like the fractures in a broken windshield. May knelt beside him, her forehead still touching the surface, her body trembling with a tension that was not fear but prayer, not desperation but surrender, and the two of them formed a tableau of penitence that was as old as the valley itself, as old as the concept of atonement, as old as the moment when the first human being looked at the damage they had caused and felt the first stirrings of guilt. The silence deepened. The thrum of the Qilin's fire faded, dropping from a vibration that shook the bones to a hum that was barely perceptible, a whisper of energy that was more suggestion than force. The creature's head, which had been raised in judgment, began to lower, its antlers dipping toward the ground in a gesture that might have been exhaustion or might have been acceptance, and the windows of its eyes, which had been blazing with the cold fire of divine rage, dimmed to a glow that was softer, warmer, almost sad. Sean felt the weight of its attention shift, felt the pressure on his skull ease from the crushing force of judgment to the gentle touch of evaluation, and he knew, with a certainty that was not hope but knowledge, that the creature was considering his offering, weighing the sincerity of his blood against the magnitude of his sin. He did not move. He did not speak. He knelt and he bled and he waited, and the valley waited with him, holding its breath, suspending the processes of decay and death that had been accelerating since the drill broke the earth. The ash stopped falling. The gelatinous stream ceased its sluggish creep. The trees, which had been gray and brittle, seemed to pause in their dissolution, as if the Qilin's hesitation had been transmitted to the entire ecosystem, a stay of execution for the valley and everything in it. Even the gravity shifted, the sideways pull that had been dragging them toward the impact site easing, relaxing, returning to a more natural downward direction that allowed Sean to sit back on his heels without feeling that he was about to slide across the glass and into the creature's hooves. And then the Qilin sighed. It was not a sound in the normal sense, not the exhalation of air through lungs and larynx, but a vibration that traveled through the ground and into their bodies, a subsonic pulse that resonated in Sean's sternum and his pelvis and the hollows of his sinuses, a frequency that bypassed the ears entirely and spoke directly to the cells, the DNA, the fundamental architecture of his being. It was a sigh of infinite weariness, of a burden carried for too long, of a grief that had no bottom and no end, and it contained within it not forgiveness but recognition, not absolution but acknowledgement. The Qilin recognized that Sean understood. It recognized that the blood on the glass was not a bribe or a payment but a confession, an admission of weight, an acceptance of the responsibility that came with being a creature of impact in a world that had been designed for gentleness. The white fire in the creature's chest dimmed further, fading from a blaze to a glow to an ember to a spark. And then it was gone, extinguished not with a flash but with a whisper, a final exhalation of energy that left the Qilin standing in the gray light of the ashen valley with no illumination but its own scales, which had lost their iridescence and become the color of old pewter, of tarnished silver, of a moon seen through clouds. The antlers, which had been crowned with cold fire, were dark now, branching structures of bone or horn or something in between, and they looked fragile, delicate, like the antlers of a deer that had survived a winter of starvation and emerged in the spring with nothing left but the memory of strength. The Qilin turned. It moved slowly, with a stiffness that suggested pain in every joint, and it walked, or rather it tread, for the Qilin did not walk in the manner of earthly creatures, toward the edge of the glassy circle, toward the unburned grass that waited beyond the perimeter. Sean watched it go, his hand still bleeding, his mind numb with the aftermath of terror and the strange, hollow feeling that followed survival, the sense that he had been emptied of everything important and left with only the shell, the container, the husk of a person who had once been full of ambition and pride and the certainty of his own righteousness. The Qilin reached the edge of the circle and its hoof touched the grass, and the grass did not bend. It remained upright, perfect, untouched, and the creature paused for a moment, its head lowered, its body sagging, and then it stepped fully onto the living earth and was gone. Not vanished, not disappeared, simply gone in the way that dreams are gone upon waking, in the way that memories fade when you try to hold them, in the way that a thought evaporates when you turn your attention to something else. One moment the Qilin was there, a solid presence of scale and antler and bone, and the next moment there was only mist, a white mist that rose from the grass and drifted across the valley, obscuring the trees and the mountains and the gray sky, and Sean was alone with May in a world that had been stripped of its guardian and left to fend for itself. They sat in silence for a long time, neither moving nor speaking, their bodies too exhausted for movement, and their minds too overwhelmed for speech. Sean looked at his hand, at the cut that was still oozing blood, and he realized that he should bind it, should apply pressure, should do the things that a rational person did when wounded, but he could not summon the energy. He simply watched the blood drip onto the glass, each drop creating a tiny, perfect circle that remained intact, that did not run or spread or merge with the other circles, and he thought about the fragility of the world, about the way a single drop of blood could be enough to appease a god or enough to condemn a valley, about the fine line between salvation and destruction that was measured not in miles or tons, but in intentions, in humility, in the willingness to kneel. May stirred beside him. She sat up, her face pale and streaked with ash and tears and the blood that had run from her nose and ears during the Qilin's final scream, and she looked at Sean with an expression that was new to her, an expression that contained gratitude and grief and something else, something that might have been love or might have been pity or might have been the recognition of a shared burden that would bind them together for the rest of their lives. "It did not forgive us," she said, her voice hoarse from the screaming and the silence, barely more than a whisper. "The Qilin does not forgive. Forgiveness is a human concept, a transaction between equals, and the Qilin is not our equal. It is our judge, our guardian, our mirror. It recognized that you understood the weight of your sin, and it accepted your offering as proof of that understanding. But it did not forgive. It simply ceased the hunt. It withdrew its attention. It left us to live with what we have done." Sean nodded, because he understood, because the distinction between forgiveness and the cessation of punishment was one that he had spent his career studying, the difference between the removal of a threat and the granting of a blessing, between neutrality and grace. They stood eventually, when the mist had thickened to the point where they could no longer see the edges of the glassy circle, when the world had been reduced to a sphere of white that contained only themselves and the ground beneath their feet and the fading warmth of the Qilin's passage. They stood, and they looked at each other, and they knew that they had to leave, had to find their way out of the valley, had to return to the world of concrete and glass and the ordinary violence of human existence. But they also knew that they could not leave the way they had entered, could not trample the grass and crush the clover and leave footprints in the mud, because the taboo of impact was still in effect, because the Qilin might have withdrawn but it had not departed, because the valley was still a sanctuary and they were still trespassers who had not yet earned the right to walk with weight. "The weightless walk," May said, and her voice was stronger now, recovering some of the authority that had been stripped from it by the Qilin's scream. "We must cross the valley without treading. We must reach the entrance path without bending a blade of grass, without bruising a moss, without displacing a single pebble. The Qilin has ceased the hunt, but the valley has not forgotten our sins. If we leave traces, if we leave impact, we may trigger its return. We may remind it of why it began the culling in the first place." Sean looked at the mist, at the invisible terrain that stretched between them and the cliff path that was their only exit, and he felt a despair that was almost as deep as the despair he had felt when the Qilin was hunting them. The journey into the valley had taken 3 days of hard trekking, of breaking through undergrowth and fording streams and climbing over fallen trees, and he could not imagine how they would retrace that path without touching the living earth, without leaving footprints, without violating the taboo that had already cost a dozen lives. But May was already moving. She stepped onto a stone that protruded from the glassy surface, a fragment of the original bedrock that had resisted the Qilin's transformation, and from there she reached for a fallen branch that lay across the grass, a limb that had been shed by one of the dying trees and was now dead wood, brown and brittle, and no longer part of the living ecosystem. She placed her foot on the branch, testing it, feeling it hold her weight without snapping, and then she stepped from the branch to another stone, and from the stone to a patch of bare earth where the soil had been compressed by the Qilin's own passage into a surface that was hard and unyielding, and from there to another branch, another stone, another island of non-living material in a sea of fragile green. Sean followed. He followed because there was no alternative, because May was the only one who knew the way, because the mist had erased the landmarks and the gravity shifts had disoriented his internal compass, and because the fear of the Qilin's return was greater than the fear of falling, of breaking an ankle, of dying in the attempt to cross the valley without impact. He followed, and the weightless walk began. It was the most difficult thing he had ever done. More difficult than his dissertation defense, more difficult than the confrontation with the pharmaceutical company that had ended his career, more difficult than the days of hiding and running and watching his colleagues die in the culling. The weightless walk required a level of attention that was almost meditative, a focus so intense that it excluded all other thoughts, all other sensations, all other concerns. Each step had to be calculated, evaluated, executed with a precision that was surgical, balletic, divine. Sean had to look at the terrain ahead and identify the safe paths, the stones and branches and bare earth that could support his weight without bending, without breaking, without leaving a trace, and he had to place his feet on those surfaces with a gentleness that was almost impossible for a human being, a creature designed by evolution to grip and push and impact, to leave marks, to change the environment, to be heavy. He stepped on a stone, and the stone held, and he reached for a branch, and the branch held, and he stepped from the branch to a patch of compressed soil, and the soil held, and he moved across the valley in this manner, a slow, halting, agonizing progression that was measured not in miles per hour, but in inches per minute. The mist surrounded them, obscuring the way ahead and the way behind, and Sean found himself in a world that had been reduced to the next step, the next breath, the next heartbeat, a narrowing of existence that was terrifying in its simplicity and liberating in its clarity. There was no past, no future, no memory of the culling, and no anticipation of escape. There was only the present moment, the present footfall, the present choice between the stone that would hold and the grass that would bend, and the choice had to be right every time because a single mistake, a single bent blade, a single displaced pebble would be enough to shatter the illusion of harmlessness, to remind the valley of their presence, to summon the Qilin from its misty retreat. The physical challenge was immense. Sean's muscles screamed with the effort of maintaining his balance on surfaces that were uneven, unstable, slippery with dew and ash, and the residue of the Qilin's passage. His arms ached from reaching for branches that were too high or too low or too far away, from catching himself when a stone shifted beneath his weight, from holding his body in positions that were unnatural and unsustainable. His mind ached from the constant vigilance, the unceasing evaluation of terrain, the calculation of angles and pressures and coefficients of friction that had to be performed in real time with no margin for error. He was sweating, despite the cold, despite the mist that chilled his skin, and the sweat ran into his eyes and stung them and blurred his vision, making the already difficult task of navigation almost impossible. But the psychological challenge was worse. The weightless walk required him to unlearn everything he knew about movement, about locomotion, about the fundamental relationship between his body and the earth. He had been taught since childhood to walk with confidence, to stride, to march, to leave footprints that said, "I was here, I am important, I matter." Now he had to walk with a humility that was almost self-erasure, to move in a way that said, "I am not here, I do not matter, I am weightless, I am harmless, I am nothing." And the nothingness was terrifying, because it touched on a truth that Sean had spent his life avoiding, the truth that human beings were not the center of the universe, not the apex of creation, not the masters of the world, but merely one species among millions, one impact among billions, one weight in a balance that was so vast and so delicate that the addition or subtraction of a single grain of sand could tip it toward catastrophe. He thought of Halloran as he walked, of the developer's arrogant stride across the clover, of the way the man had placed his feet with a confidence that was the product of a lifetime of entitlement, a lifetime of believing that the earth existed to support him, that the grass existed to cushion him, that the world existed to be shaped by his will. Halloran had bent the grass, had crushed the clover, had left footprints in the mud, and the Qilin had judged him for it, had found him heavy, had found his impact excessive, had removed him from the valley with a violence that was proportional to his violence. And Sean, who had bent his share of grass in his life, who had crushed his share of clover, who had left his share of footprints in mud and snow and sand, was now trying to undo all of that, to walk as if he had never been born, to cross the valley as if he were a ghost, a memory, a rumor of a person rather than the person himself. May moved ahead of him, her smaller body lighter, her steps more certain, and she seemed to float across the terrain, to find the safe paths with an intuition that was not learned but inherited, not trained but innate. She was the guide's apprentice, the child of the valley, and she understood its language in a way that Sean never could, in a way that was encoded in her cells, her bones, her breath. She knew which stones were stable and which were loose, which branches were dead and which were merely sleeping, which patches of earth were compacted and which were soft, and she moved with a grace that was almost inhuman, almost divine, a grace that made Sean feel clumsy and heavy and hopelessly inadequate by comparison. But she waited for him. At every difficult crossing, every gap between safe surfaces that required a leap or a stretch or a balancing act, she paused and looked back, her eyes meeting his with an encouragement that was silent but absolute, a communication that bypassed words and said simply, "You can do this. You are doing this. Do not stop. Do not give up." The valley is watching, and the Qilin is watching, and they are waiting to see if you are worthy of the gift they have given you. And Sean would find the strength to continue, to reach for the next branch, to place his foot on the next stone, to pull himself across the next gap, because May believed in him, because the valley had not yet rejected him, because the Qilin had not yet returned. They crossed the stream where the water had turned to gel, and Sean had to step on stones that were slippery with the viscous fluid, stones that shifted and rolled beneath his weight and threatened to send him plunging into the gelatinous current. He fell once, his foot slipping on a moss-covered rock and his knee dipped into the stream, and the gel coated his skin with a coldness that was not wetness but something else, a sensation of being touched by the valley itself, of being evaluated by the water, and he pulled himself up with a surge of panic that he immediately suppressed, because panic was heavy, panic was impact, panic was the trigger that would summon the Qilin. He stood on the bank, his knee dripping with gel, and he waited for the judgment, for the white fire to appear in the mist, for the hoof to descend and crush him into the glass. But nothing came. The mist remained white and still. The stream continued its sluggish creep. And May, who had watched the fall with a face that was pale but composed, simply extended her hand and helped him to the next stone, the next branch, the next safe surface, and they continued their journey without comment, without recrimination, because there was no time for either, because the valley was vast and the mist was thick and the exit was still hours or days away. They walked through the forest where the trees were gray and brittle, and Sean had to resist the temptation to touch them, to steady himself against their trunks, because the trees were still alive barely, and to touch them would be to impact them, to transfer his weight to their weakened structures, to hasten their collapse. He walked with his arms extended for balance, like a tightrope walker, like a drunkard, like a child learning to navigate a world that was suddenly treacherous. And the ash fell on his shoulders and his hair and his eyelashes, coating him in a gray mantle that made him look like a statue, like a monument, like a fossil of a person who had been caught in the act of fleeing a catastrophe. The hours passed. The mist did not lift. The sun, if there was a sun, remained hidden behind layers of cloud and ash and the residual glow of the Qilin's fire, and the valley existed in a perpetual twilight that was neither day nor night but a suspension of both, a timelessness that was appropriate to a place that had been removed from the ordinary flow of existence. Sean lost track of time, lost track of distance, lost track of everything except the next step, the next breath, the next heartbeat. He became a machine of pure attention, a sensor array mounted on a skeleton, a consciousness that had been stripped of everything except the immediate physical task of survival. And then, without warning, the mist began to thin. Sean noticed it gradually, in the way that one notices the fading of a headache or the easing of a fever, a subtle change in the quality of the light that suggested they were approaching an edge, a boundary, a place where the valley's influence ended and the ordinary world began. The trees became greener, less brittle, and the ash stopped falling, and the gravity, which had been shifting unpredictably since the Qilin's rage, settled into a consistent downward pull that was almost comforting in its familiarity. The air smelled different, less of ozone and more of pine, less of death and more of life, and Sean felt a hope that he had not allowed himself to feel since the culling began, a hope that was dangerous because it was premature, because they were not yet safe, because the valley could still change its mind. May stopped. She stood on a boulder that overlooked a clearing and she pointed, and Sean followed her gaze and saw the cliff path. It was there, the narrow track that had been carved into the rock face by the monks of the 6th century, the entrance to the valley that they had descended 3 days ago in a mood of excitement and anticipation and the arrogant confidence of tourists. It was there, and it was real, and it led upward away from the valley, toward the mountains, toward the world, toward survival. But between them and the path was the clearing, and in the center of the clearing was the Qilin. It was not the same Qilin, or perhaps it was the same Qilin but transformed, diminished, reduced from the towering creature of white fire and iridescent scales to something smaller, something more fragile, something that looked like a deer that had been starved through a hard winter. Its scales were dull gray, its antlers were bare of fire, its eyes were closed, and it stood with its head lowered, its body swaying slightly, as if the effort of remaining upright was almost too much for it. It was blocking the path, not deliberately, not as a guardian blocking the gate, but simply because it was there, because it had collapsed in exhaustion, because the rage and the grief and the final sigh had taken everything from it and left it as empty as the valley itself. Sean and May stood on the boulder, looking down at the creature, and Sean felt a complex emotion that he could not name, a mixture of pity and awe and guilt and something that might have been love, the love of a creature for another creature that has suffered, that has been broken, that has been left alone with a burden that was too heavy for any single being to carry. He wanted to approach it, to touch it, to offer comfort, but he knew that the Qilin was not a thing that could be comforted, not a being that accepted touch, and he knew that to approach it would be to violate the taboo one final time, to remind it of his weight, his impact, his existence. But they had to pass. The cliff path was their only escape, and the Qilin was lying across the entrance to the clearing, its body curled like a sleeping cat, its hooves tucked beneath it, its antlers resting on the ground. There was no way around it, no way over it, no way under it. They would have to wait for it to move, or they would have to wake it, or they would have to find another path, and there was no other path, and the Qilin might sleep for hours or days or years, and they did not have hours or days or years. They had minutes, perhaps, before the valley completed its transformation into a wasteland, before the last of the green faded into gray, before the glassy soil swallowed everything. May made a decision. She stepped from the boulder onto the grass of the clearing, and Sean watched in horror as her foot descended, as her weight pressed against the living earth, as the grass bent beneath her soul, as the clover compressed, as the impact was made, as the taboo was violated. But the Qilin did not stir. It did not open its eyes. It did not rise in rage and crush her with its hooves or incinerate her with its fire. It simply slept, or whatever passed for sleep in a creature that had never been awake in the human sense, and May walked across the clearing with slow, deliberate steps, each one bending the grass, each one leaving a footprint, each one a violation, and the Qilin let her pass. She reached the far side of the clearing, the entrance to the cliff path, and she turned and looked back at Sean with an expression that said, "It is safe. It is too tired to care. Come. Come quickly, before it wakes, before it remembers, before the rage returns." And Sean stepped from the boulder, and his foot touched the grass, and the grass bent, and he felt the impact in his soul, the weight of his existence pressing against the earth, and he walked across the clearing with tears streaming down his face, because he was violating the taboo, because he was heavy, because he was human, and because the Qilin in its exhaustion had allowed him to be. He passed within 5 feet of the creature, close enough to smell its scent, which was not the smell of animal or fire, but of ozone and ancient stone and something else, something that might have been sorrow or might have been peace. And he saw its chest rise and fall with a rhythm that was slow and shallow, the breathing of a creature that was not dead but was not fully alive either, that existed in a state between states, a suspension of being that might last forever or might end in the next moment. He saw the scales on its flank, dull and gray and beautiful in their simplicity, and he saw a wound there, a gash that had not been made by any weapon but by the creature's own fire, a self-inflicted injury that was the physical manifestation of its grief. And he understood that the Qilin had been damaged by its own rage, wounded by its own judgment, broken by its own duty. He reached the cliff path, and May took his hand, and they began to climb. They climbed with a desperation that was physical, their muscles burning, their lungs heaving, their fingers bloody from the rough stone, and they did not look back, because looking back would be to see the Qilin, to see the valley, to see the ruins of a sanctuary that they had destroyed, and that had almost destroyed them in return. They climbed, and the mist thinned, and the light grew stronger, and the air became cleaner, and the sounds of the ordinary world began to filter down to them, the wind in the pines, the cry of a hawk, the distant rumble of a river that was not the gelatinous stream of the valley but a real river, a living river, a river that flowed. They reached the top of the cliff path as the sun was setting, or perhaps rising, they could not tell, and they collapsed on a ledge of rock that overlooked the valley, and they looked back. The valley was there, spread out below them like a map, like a model, like a memory, and it was beautiful even in its devastation, the gray circles of scorched earth contrasting with the patches of green that had survived, the glassy surfaces reflecting the sky in shattered mirrors, the trees standing like skeletons in a landscape that had been stripped of its softness. And in the center of it all, in the clearing by the cliff path, the Qilin was visible, a small figure of gray and silver, motionless, waiting, and Sean knew that it would wait there forever, or until the valley healed, or until the next group of arrogant humans followed a map into the green and triggered the rage all over again. They did not speak. There was nothing to say that could encompass what they had experienced, what they had seen, what they had survived. They simply sat on the ledge, holding hands, watching the valley, and they waited for the tears to stop, for the shaking to subside, for the world to become solid again. And eventually, after hours or minutes or days, they stood, and they walked away from the ledge, and they followed the mountain path that led to the villages, to the roads, to the cities, to the world that had not known the Qilin and would not believe in it if they told the story. But they would tell the story. Sean knew this, knew it with a certainty that was deeper than fear or hope or the desire for credibility. He would tell the story, not because anyone would believe him, but because the story was true, because the valley was real, because the Qilin existed in a realm that was not myth and not science but something that encompassed both, something that demanded a new language, a new category, a new way of understanding the relationship between the human and the earth. He would tell the story of the 12 who had entered the valley and the 2 who had left it, of the drill and the fire and the blood, of the weightless walk and the final sigh. And he would tell it knowing that it would mark him as a madman, a fanatic, a mystic. And he would tell it anyway because the alternative was silence, and silence was complicity, and complicity was the sin that had started everything. May walked beside him, and she too was changed, and she too would carry the story, but she would carry it differently, in the language of the keepers, in the songs and the prayers and the warnings that were passed from generation to generation, from apprentice to guide, from mother to child. She would become the head keeper one day, the guardian of the taboo, and she would meet the next expedition at the entrance to the valley with the same resigned expression that the old woman had worn, and she would tell them the same warnings, and she would watch them make the same mistakes. And she would know, as the old woman had known, that warning was futile, that the arrogant would always find a way to trigger the catastrophe, that the Qilin would always be needed, always be grieving, always be waiting in the mist for the next sin that required judgment. They reached a village on the second day, or the third, and they were fed and clothed and given water and shelter, and the villagers looked at them with the curiosity of people who had seen other survivors stumble out of the mountains, other refugees from the valley, other witnesses to the guardian's rage. They did not ask questions. They knew better. They simply gave Sean and May what they needed and sent them on their way, back to the cities, back to the world, back to the ordinary violence of human existence that was, in its own way, as devastating as the Qilin's fire, as relentless as the culling, as absolute as the taboo of impact. And Sean, who had been a disgraced biologist, became something else. He became a voice, a warning, a prophet without honor in his own country, and he spent the rest of his life trying to teach people what he had learned in the valley, trying to make them understand that the world was fragile, that the grass beneath their feet was not indestructible, that the balance was not guaranteed, that the Qilin was not a myth but a metaphor for the consequences of arrogance, a symbol of the judgment that awaited those who took without giving, who broke without mending, who walked heavy in a world that required lightness. He never returned to the valley. He knew that he could not, that his presence would be a reminder of the sin, that the Qilin, even in its exhaustion, would recognize him and judge him again, and that the next judgment might not be as merciful as the first. But he thought about it every day, every hour, every moment of his waking life and in his dreams. And in his dreams he walked the weightless walk, stepping from stone to stone, from branch to branch, from the present to the past, and the Qilin walked beside him, not as a predator but as a companion, not as a judge but as a teacher, and the grass beneath their feet remained upright, unbent, perfect, and the world was whole, and the balance was restored, and the silence was not empty but full of the sound of a single breath that contained the weight of all creation. And sometimes in the deepest part of the night, when the city was asleep and the stars were visible through the smog, Sean would stand in his apartment and look down at his feet, at the carpet that bore the impression of his weight, at the floorboards that creaked beneath his step, and he would remember the clover, the grass that had not bent, the earth that had forgotten him, and he would weep. He would weep for the valley, for the Qilin, for the spirit insects that had been crushed by the drill, for the balance that had been broken and could never be fully restored. He would weep for Halloran, for Kowalski, for Okonkwo, for all the ones who had been judged and found heavy. He would weep for May, who had survived but would never be free of the valley, who would carry the taboo until she died and passed it to the next keeper. And he would weep for himself, for the man he had been before the valley, the man who had walked heavy through the world without knowing it, without caring, without understanding that every step was an impact, every breath was a weight, every life was a footprint in the delicate soil of existence. He would weep, and then he would lie down and he would close his eyes and he would listen. He would listen for the sigh, the subsonic vibration that had resonated in his bones, the sound of the Qilin's recognition and its withdrawal. And sometimes, in the silence of the city, in the spaces between the traffic and the construction and the endless human noise, he would hear it. Not clearly, not definitively, but as a memory, an echo, a ghost of a sound that reminded him that the valley was still there, still waiting, still guarded by a creature that tread without weight and judged without mercy, and that the world beneath his feet was fragile, so fragile as a blade of clover, as fragile as a single breath, as fragile as the balance between the human and the divine. And he would sleep, and he would dream, and in his dreams he would walk weightless through a valley of silence, and the Qilin would be there, watching, waiting, and the grass would not bend, and the water would not ripple, and the air would not tremble, and the world would be whole, and he would be whole, and the weight of a single breath would be enough to sustain him, enough to redeem him, enough to carry him through the darkness and into the light that was not white fire but something softer, something gentler, something that had no name but felt like forgiveness, like peace, like the end of the hunt and the beginning of the healing that would last, if not forever, then at least for as long as the grass remained upright and the Qilin remained in the mist and the valley remained silent, waiting, patient, eternal. Thank you for listening to today's stories. If you enjoyed, please leave a like and subscribe, so you don't miss the stories yet to come.